Welcome to the Dread Journal. I am Ulrich Mossberg, and I shall be your guide through some of the most horrifying true stories sent to us. These stories are not urban legends, myths, or tall tales. They are true testimonials sent to us by those who have worked on oil rigs. These are tales sent by those who feel they must hide their identities, either due to the question of their sanities or hiding from corporate authorities, but still want to be heard. Oil rigs are some of the most desolate places on our planet. They are surrounded by deep, dark waters, and the terrors they hide are reflected in these stories. Now, let us look into some of these tales and see what will forever be added into the Dread Journal. I'm sending you this story with the names changed due to privacy concerns, both yours and mine. When I tried telling other people about this story, they either thought I was crazy or had had a few too many drinks. I also know that the information I'm about to share is going to change the way you look at the world, so do with it what you will, but I'm trusting that someone will finally believe it. My name is Frank, and I was an electrician on a spar oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico. When I first started working there, I had to get used to the 12-hour shifts, but it wasn't too bad, considering I had a 2-week vacation every month. At the time, I had no kids or wife. I had an apartment near New Orleans, and the job paid well, so I spent my free time eating good food and drinking on Bourbon Street. My coworkers were all hard-hat blue-collar workers, save for the rig managers, geologists, and engineers with whom I also worked. There was one guy I worked with called Sam. Sam was a joker, and he was always one of the people who livened up the place. His go-to humor was perverted in nature, but in a work environment without women, he was able to get away with it. Sam was originally from Florida and had always spent his time around the ocean. He was a floorman and was able to get this job after he had to drop out of college. Although some of the older guys saw him as annoying at first, his humor and warm, supportive personality gave life to the often boring work environment. Sam was in school to study meteorology, but he had to drop out for financial reasons. He had to take out loans just to attend, and there was no financial aid available to him. Even so, Sam knew that he wanted to go back and finish his degree. Eventually, almost all of the other guys and I saw him as our nephew, and despite his humor, he was a hard worker. I even remember having gumbo and drinks with him whenever we visited New Orleans. The other guy I'll mention is John, a rig manager. Despite his position, he just wanted us to call him John because he found formalities annoying. John was the opposite of Sam in almost every respect. John was serious, strict, and punctual with everything he did. Unless it was work-related and urgent, he was the kind of guy you wouldn't want to talk to. John was there to work. He was the only guy who didn't take to Sam. While he wasn't pleasant, he was efficient, and in all of my years of working on oil rigs as an electrician, I had never seen anyone as dedicated as him. No one really knew why he was so obsessed with the job, but we didn't question it because he was fair to everyone, and he would often give brief praise to someone who had fixed an issue, saying things like good work or well done before leaving it at that. Sam did try to get him to open up a few times, but after a few botched interactions, John just started ignoring Sam unless it was urgent. Eventually, the two gave each other space, and work continued like that for a while, with John only talking to Sam when it was necessary, and Sam knowing to save his humor for the other guys. At least, that's how it was supposed to be. One day in July, Sam went back to the rig as usual before me. I would spend another 3 days by myself after I saw him off at his Uber back home. The next day, I overdid it in one of the bars, and spent that night trying to sleep off the booze I had drunk earlier. At around 3 a.m., I got a phone call from my supervisor on the rig. He told me that there had been an electrical fire. While the rig was fine and we were able to keep it under wraps from the media, Sam had died in the fire. His body suffered multiple grievous burn wounds, and he ended up passing away before the paramedics could make it to the rig. I was shocked to hear this, and all I could do was try my best to try and stay calm, as my supervisor explained that his family was already notified and that the rig was still safe to work on. But I could feel my tears trickling down my face as I heard that. His funeral was a few weeks later. It was a closed casket due to the burn wounds, and he was buried in Florida. None of us could attend because of our work, so we just raised a toast to him during one of our lunch breaks and promised to keep working as best as we could in his memory. Even John, who was in the lunchroom with us, raised his cup and said, "To Sam." A year later, I was still working on the oil rig after a raise and a renewed contract came my way. By then, most of the guys who worked with Sam went on to other careers. The only one whom I still recognized was John, and while I didn't like interacting with him on most days, it was good to know that there was someone besides me who remembered Sam. One night, I was checking the equipment in the communications booth, ensuring that everything was working properly, and replacing some of the older components during the usual monthly inspection. John's office was next door, and while it was a bit later at night, he was still on his computer, looking over some documents that I couldn't see. I was near one of the desks of the communications workers who was on lunch break, and I heard a voice come out of his headphones. The other guy was looking over records of communications on his desk, and I went over to him after I closed the circuit panel. "Hey, I'm hearing a voice coming out of the headphones," I said, and he turned to look at me with a raised eyebrow. "That's impossible. It's 10 p.m. and the sonars haven't picked up anything," he responded, and I pointed to the headphones that had the voice coming from it. "Okay, then how do you explain that?" I asked, and when he turned to look at it, he heard the noise too and seemed annoyed. It must be one of the radios again. We've had issues with those interfering with our communications," he responded before getting up. "I'll see who it is this time," he said, almost sounding defeated. Once he put on the headphones, he spoke into the microphone. "This is Oil Rig 237 hailing from the communications room. Please identify yourself," he said. And within seconds, he turned to me. "Hey, you're Frank, right?" he asked, and I nodded. "Yeah, that's me," I said plainly, and he took off the headphones. "Apparently, whoever it is wants to speak to you," he said, and I seemed confused as I walked over to put on the headphones. "Frank speaking," I said, expecting to hear someone asking me how to fix their walkie or solve whatever issue was causing it on their floor. And after a few seconds, I heard a voice. "Deck 3, 4 o'clock a.m., the voice said, and I froze on the spot. "Sam!" I shouted out, loud enough for even John to hear, and the voice spoke again. "Deck 3, 4 a.m., it said, and I threw the headphones off while breathing heavily. My heart pounded as the communications worker looked up at me, then picked up the headphones from the floor. "What's the matter with you?" he asked, looking confused, and I couldn't begin to put my thoughts together until I came to a conclusion that made me angry. This had to be a prank. Someone who knew Sam was on this rig besides me and was somehow able to get his voice. I grabbed the headphones again in a rage, and I nearly screamed into them. "Listen, you piece of garbage. If you're gonna prank me, then prank me, but don't use Sam's voice again!" I shouted, and before I could hear anything else, John's door opened and he came up to me and took the headphones off me, glaring at me like I had done something awful. "My office, now," he said, and I walked into his office, leaving the communications worker confused, but he put the headphones back on before John closed the door, and we both sat down. John was across from me at his desk, and I was now less worried about hearing Sam's voice than I was about having John be angry with me. John just looked at me with his piercing gaze and put his hands together, interlocking his fingers as they covered his mouth and nose. "Explain yourself," he said, and I took a deep breath. "Look, I'm sorry for the outburst. It's just that I heard Sam's voice over the communications," I explained, and John didn't so much as blink. "Sam? You mean the one that died here last year?" he asked, not changing his intonation. All I could do was nod. Frank, John began. I know what happened was upsetting, but that was last year. Put it behind you, he said, not even acknowledging what I said. I looked at him in confusion. Sir, with all due respect, I don't think it's a matter of being upset over the loss of a friend so much as, I said, before John showed me his open hand, telling me to stop. Then you believe someone is playing a joke on you? He asked, and I nodded in response. John returned his hand to where it was before, looking at me. Then I will find the person responsible. Finish your shift. I want no further outbursts. Are we understood? John asked, and I knew that arguing with him wasn't going to do anything, so I nodded, understanding that this was out of my hands. John motioned for me to return to the door, and the communications worker didn't hear anything else after my outburst. The rest of my shift continued as usual, and I couldn't get what happened out of my mind, least of all the phrase, Deck 3, 4 o'clock a.m. I didn't have any scheduled maintenance on that deck, and I didn't want to upset John any further, so I didn't go to Deck 3. It was midnight when I finished my shift, and around 1 o'clock when I got to bed. While I was upset, I was still able to get some sleep, so I could wake up and start my usual time to work the next day. I woke up feeling more tired than rested, and I got to the lunchroom to have breakfast, but I heard shouting coming from the employee lounge from one of the supervisors. I looked at the guy eating next to me as if nothing was happening, and asked him what was going on. Apparently, one of the mooring lines broke off last night, and the personnel on duty were being questioned for not properly maintaining it. I then heard shouting from the room. The lines on Deck 3 needed to be reported for tension. The line broke at exactly 4 o'clock on your watch, the supervisor shouted. My breath hitched as I heard that. I stopped chewing the scrambled eggs in my mouth, suddenly remembering what I heard last night. That was exactly what Sam's voice said over the radio. Deck 3, 4 o'clock a.m. After I was done eating, I needed to get answers, so while I knew this was a bad idea, I got into uniform and walked into John's office. He was there looking over reports, and I knocked on the door. He glanced up and saw me, looking annoyed, but he waved me in. I walked in and took a seat. John, did you find the person responsible for the voice last night? I asked, and John shook his head in response. Frank, I have a snapped mooring line to handle. I don't have time to look into minor employee misconduct, he said, in his usual tone. Did the mooring line break on Deck 3 at exactly 4 o'clock a.m.? I asked, and John's expression changed from annoyance to curiosity. It did. How did you know that? He asked. Last night, when I thought I heard Sam's voice, it said Deck 3, 4 o'clock a.m., I explained, and John looked even more confused. Are you saying that someone was telling you about this and you didn't report it? He asked, and I shook my head. With all due respect, if I had told you that last night, you wouldn't have taken me seriously. Hell, I can't even believe something happened after I heard that voice, I explained, and John stayed quiet for a moment, considering my words. He sighed after he realized I was right. Fine. Report back to me during your lunch hour, and I'll bring in the same worker who also heard the voice. We'll see about solving this issue, he said, and I nodded at him. The lunch hour came, and the three of us were in the communications room. The worker explained that, aside from the voice, there was no evidence of any tampering with the communications equipment, and all else seemed to be working fine otherwise. Then it happened. The same headset started speaking, and John ordered it to be put on speaker so we could all hear it, and it spoke again. South by southwest, 9 o'clock p.m., it said, in Sam's voice. John didn't seem to flinch as he heard Sam's voice, and responded into the microphone. Identify yourself, John said, only to be met with the same response. South by southwest, 9 o'clock p.m., the voice said, and it spoke no more. The communications equipment went back to normal, and John seemed deep in thought. Very strange, John said, and he sighed before he turned to look at me. Get back to work, Frank. I'll handle this, John said, and I looked at him in confusion. John, you can't just say you'll handle this. That was Sam's voice, I nearly shouted, and John glared at me. Whoever's voice that was is irrelevant. Someone caused damage to this oil rig when they snapped our mooring line, and they've issued their next threat. This is a security issue, not an electrical one. Get back to work, he said, calmly, coldly, and with all the professionalism I had come to know for him. I wanted to push back more, but I knew it wouldn't have amounted to anything, so I returned to my duties. Around 8:30, about 3 hours after my lunch break, I was working on one of the west sides of the oil rig, doing maintenance, when I felt a sudden movement that almost took me off my feet. I could hear the wind from outside the wall howling, and due to the missing mooring line, the oil rig was drifting due to the wind. But I worked on oil rigs long enough to know that there was a waterspout coming. There was something off about this situation, though. We normally got warnings from our weather detection systems so we could evacuate or take shelter before they appeared, with enough time to react. This would have been doubly true considering we lost one of our mooring lines, of course. But I didn't have time to think about it in that moment. So instead, I reached for my radio and shouted into it. "All workers, take shelter! A waterspout is coming!" I said, and within seconds, another drift happened, nearly knocking me off my feet. After I regained my balance, I heard John on the other side. "Cancel that order. Our systems are not detecting any waterspouts, and some drifting from wind turbulence is to be expected with a missing mooring line," John said, and I got on the walkie again as I ran to the shelter. "You can't be serious, John! We need to take shelter now!" I shouted as I tried to gain my balance in the drifting. And I knew that John was feeling it too, which is why what he said shocked me. "I am serious. If any worker does not complete their quotas by the end of the night, they can expect a write-up. Frank, I'd like to see you in my office after your shift is done," John said, and I grunted in exasperation as the drifting continued. Once I made it to the shelter, I saw a few other workers there too, mostly the newer, younger guys who seemed scared for their lives. I hunkered down with them as the rig continued to drift slowly in the direction of the missing mooring line, and around 8:50, I heard John on the radio. "All workers, take shelter! There is a waterspout!" John shouted, finally realizing the truth. And soon after, the rest of the workers, John included, joined us in the shelter within minutes. At precisely 9:00 p.m., the rig was rocking back and forth, and the sounds of groaning metal and howling wind screamed from outside the shelter. An hour later, the drifting ended, and everything seemed to be back to normal. When we walked out, there was some minor flooding from the waterspout itself, and the southwest corner's roof had caved in, with more rain coming in, accentuated by the sound of the wind. John immediately ordered the communications workers to call for help, and he took me into his office, which was still intact. John's usual glare was on me, but this time I was glaring at him back. "Frank, you are aware that there are consequences for insubordination, correct?" he asked, looking at me, and I could feel the air leave my lungs. "Insubordination? That's what you're worried about? John, we could have lost lives tonight. Some of the younger guys who were in the shelter when I first called out were in that southwest corner," I shouted, and John clenched his fists. "And they would have had more than enough time to reach the shelter when I ordered the evacuation. There is nothing in your contract that says—" I interrupted him there. "You gotta be kidding me!" I screamed at him. "John, get your head out of your work for 3 seconds and listen to yourself. We're getting warnings from Sam or whatever's using his voice, and the one time we had to take it seriously, you're choosing to ignore it until the last second?" I asked, no longer caring about my job as I glared at him. "What you're hearing," he said, accentuating each word, "is nothing more than some mindless chatter on the radio that's clearly coming from offshore somewhere. The fact that you identify it with Sam is nothing more than a coincidence at best or a mental failure of yours," he said, keeping his detached and cold demeanor. "Yeah, and if I hadn't ordered the evacuation then and there, would everyone still be alive? Would those young guys who took me seriously not be under a caved-in roof?" I asked, and before John could speak again, I kept going. "And another thing, Sam's voice predicted the mooring line snapping, and now he predicted the waterspout. Even if it's not Sam, then you can't deny that these things that are happening match up completely to the warnings we've been getting," I shouted, and John's face turned red for the first time, before he collected himself and took a breath. It was the first time I had ever seen him act this way. "Are you quite finished?" he asked, maintaining his cold professionalism, and I just glared at him as he spoke. Frank, as I said, these are nothing more than coincidences. Are you honestly telling me I should obey whatever random noise comes out of the radio? And all this talk of predictions. You're a man of science, not superstition. You can't possibly tell me you believe this, he said, looking at me. Yeah? What about you saying that you were going to handle it? My tone rose in aggravation. You said yourself that this was a security issue. What were you doing this whole time? Trying to track where the voice was coming from? Interrogating the workers? Looking for bugs in the computer system? Each word was louder than the last, before the communications worker rushed into the office. Frank? His nervous voice caught mine and John's interest. There's another message for you. It's from the same voice. Without a word, I marched to the speaker and talked into the microphone. Frank here. Go ahead, I declared, with my finger tremoring on the button. All areas, 3 o'clock a.m., Sam's voice declared. What? I whispered to myself, and then the voice repeated itself. All areas, 3 o'clock a.m. Silence returned to the microphone, and I jerked my arm to see my wristwatch. It was 11:12 p.m. I then turned to John, who was listening to all of this, and I nodded at him. Well, still want to write me up, or are we getting the hell out of here? My voice sounding less like a question and more like a challenge. John looked at the terrified worker who was looking at the both of us before he slammed his fist against the wall. The other worker winced, but I was too angry to care about the sudden change of pace from John. There should be an emergency maintenance crew on the way, John nearly growled, keeping his voice low. In the meantime, if there's even one more outburst from you, Frank, I'm firing you on the spot. He walked back into his office and slammed the door shut, rubbing the bruise on his knuckles where he had slammed his fist. As I walked out of the communications room, one of the younger guys was waiting for me, and I looked into his eyes. They were clearly terrified after this whole ordeal, but he had a phone in his hand. It was open, and there was a call from an unknown number. Hello, Frank, the voice said, and out came Sam's voice. I felt my eyelids recede to the back of my skull, but I kept listening. My death wasn't an accident. John set it up. He was sick of getting less respect from the workers. You have to get out of there, Frank. My blood pressure rose with each word. I wanted to go back into the office and strangle John myself, but I had bigger issues now. Something was going to happen to the oil rig, and if I didn't get myself and as many people as I could out, I didn't want to know what the consequences were. Sam laughed on the other side. I'll see you at Bourbon Street with some honeys, he said, before the call ended, and the young guy looked up at me, clearly scared out of his wits. I nodded and looked at him. Call the Coast Guard. We have to get out of here now, I said, and the younger guy nodded, calling the mainland. Within a few hours, at around 2 a.m., the Coast Guard arrived with helicopters and boats. Strangely enough, John was gone. There was a missing boat from the oil rig that had left. I also noticed his computer was missing too, which probably contained evidence of his murder of Sam. At 3 o'clock a.m., after we were all safely evacuated, the oil rig's living quarters broke off and it sunk the rest of the platform. Fortunately, the dig site held and no oil spill happened, so when the local news reported it, it was treated as simply as a result of the damage from the water spout. I quit working for the company that same day, but I still come back to Bourbon Street every year around July when Sam passed. The communications guy and the younger guy, who also heard Sam's voice, were soon admitted to a mental hospital after they swore they had heard the voice of a dead man. John's boat was never found, and due to the extensive damage on the rig, there was no way to implicate him as Sam's murderer. As for me, the thought of joining the men in the mental hospital is not one I relish, especially not since I now have a wife and 2 kids to care for. I only heard Sam's voice once more. He called me when I was in the men's room at a restaurant on Bourbon Street, and he only said one thing. I got him. I haven't received any calls since that day, and I promised myself I would never work on an oil rig again. I'm sending you this story as proof that I existed. Please, whatever you do, don't let this fall into the hands of the company I worked for. Send it to the papers, or the news, or whatever other media that exists. I just can't live with myself if I keep this story private. Someone has to know what we did, and not to repeat this mistake again. I'm Mark, and I've been a welder by trade for most of my life. My dad was a welder, as was his father before him, so I picked up the trade myself. When I was told that a major oil company needed a licensed welder to come out and work on one of their rigs, I was one of the first people to sign on. A few interviews later, I got the job. The company made me work in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, and I was given housing in Fort Myers alongside a few other workers. I was also given deep sea certification for underwater welding work, courtesy of the company. I made friends with the guys I worked with. There was Jose, a Cuban from Miami who drank too much of that rocket fuel coffee, Jean Paul, a Haitian who was a devout Catholic, and Jack, a Texan, who made the best barbecue I've ever had. We were all welders by trade, and while we came from different backgrounds, we respected each other and shared in our traditions together when we weren't on the rig. I also made sure to keep the guys fit. We went to the gym at least once every other day, and thanks to my intense workout regimen, I was able to whip them into shape. Our shifts mostly consisted of us performing maintenance on the structural integrity of the rig. We did work both on the rig itself, where the rest of the people worked, and on some underwater spots whenever the need called. Learning to work underwater as a welder was a challenge, but I managed to learn the ropes within my first few days. Of course, I also knew how dangerous the job could be, but we always had a team watching over us from the rig itself. We would spend entire days, or even a full week, in a saturation chamber to get our bodies used to the pressure we would experience as a result of going down there. It was rough to get used to it, but thanks to the exercise we did in Fort Myers, we were able to do it without any serious concerns. The worst parts about that chamber was getting used to it when we first went in, and then getting reacclimated to normal pressure once we were out. Our supervisor was an older man named August. He had been around the company for decades and was getting on in his years, but he treated us like family, often sharing funny stories of his childhood or talking about his grandkids, showing us pictures of them whenever he had the chance. He was the one overseeing our activities alongside the rig managers and other eggheads who worked on the rig. He was also a Catholic, like Jean Paul, and the two led us in prayer for every meal. I wasn't a believer, but I chose to respect their beliefs and join in their prayers. Overall, things went pretty well for us for the first few shifts, and Fort Myers had plenty of places for us to unwind. If those days had lasted until the end of my contract, then I probably would have left the rig behind and gone on to start up my own welding business, or find a contract with some other oil company. Sadly, that wasn't what happened. During one of my shifts in January, we were told that the company was installing some new drills that would allow us to dig deeper into the reserves. August seemed thrilled about the change, as the rig was barely making its quota over the last year. I thought this was a good opportunity for the welding crew too. It would show that we were capable of working with new equipment, and if we helped set it up, it would allow us to get raises, or at least look good on our resumes. The day the new digging equipment came, it also came with a representative from the company to oversee the installation. The guy was a big shot engineer the company had hired named James. I was told he graduated from some big Ivy League school, but it didn't matter to me that he had some degree. What mattered was if he knew what he was talking about. I had some reservations when I first heard about him from the rig managers, but I was later told that James was August's youngest son. I felt relieved as soon as I heard that. August's son shouldn't have been too different from him, and I was hoping James would be like his old man. Then James actually showed up. He came on board wearing a suit and tie, looking like he had just walked out of a high-rise building in New York City, and had glasses as round as my gut. His hair was short, sharp, and perfectly combed. I instantly thought he was some kind of fish out of water, as ironic as that saying felt at the time. And the first thing he did was look at the welding crew and sized us up, like he was looking at a piece of equipment when he met us. Rather than the warm smile and friendly demeanor August showed us, James took one look at us and didn't so much as blink before he turned away. "They'll do." His footsteps receded as he returned to talk to one of the rig managers. Immediately, all of us felt uncomfortable with that reaction, but August laughed it off. He assured us that James was quirky and a bit odd at times, but he ultimately meant no harm. I decided to shrug it off. He was clearly from a different world than the rest of us, and as such, he had different things to focus on. From there, he had a whole presentation ready on how to install the drill. He went over each detail with precision, and while I didn't understand the new technology he was talking about, I did understand the parts where he spoke about welding. It was simple enough, just weld some parts together once they were underwater, being careful not to cause any imbalances, so I wasn't too worried about it. The work began right after, and we suited up. I was used to wearing the diving gear by now. It had been a few months since I started, and the training was pretty simple. There was a radio in my diving suit, and we had flashlights to see our surroundings. I wasn't even afraid of the sharks, since they weren't as bad as the movies made them out to be. The worst they did was swim close a few times, but they left after we stood still, and it's not like I would get in trouble for using my welder on an animal that was trying to bite me. The one thing I didn't get used to was the darkness. It wasn't a big deal most of the time, but I hated the idea that something could come after me in the water, and I wouldn't have much time to react to it. I kept getting told that we had sonar in place to account for that, but no amount of blips and boops on a screen manned by August was ever going to make me feel better about going down there. I never voiced this feeling to anyone, though. Not like I could. For one, the guys would laugh at me for being afraid of the dark, and for two, if I wanted to work, I would have to go down there. Still, though, it unsettled me every time I took the bell from the pressure chamber to the seafloor. I would always make sure to see the moment from when we could see the blue water turn darker until it was pitch black. Once we were there, we hooked up to our umbilical breathing cords and walked to the diving point. The one thing no one ever told me about the deep ocean is how much sound there is. I thought it'd be quiet, but the truth is, sound travels quite fast, and the worst part about it is that you can never tell where it's coming from. I've heard everything from whales to dolphins, even some sounds that I couldn't or didn't want to identify. But the sound that no one ever talks about is the water itself. It's always moving, even if it doesn't look like it does, and even as deep as we were going, around 450 feet, I could still hear it. It's almost like a howling wind at the bottom of the ocean, and while it was the first sound that I heard every time I was out there, it was one I never fully got used to. The good news is that it was often a secondary sound, as the constant work chatter between the guys, August, and me kept me sane while we were working. We also left from the same door to work outside, and then came back in the same door at the same time. We had a bellman, but for the life of me I can't remember his name. He was there to make sure we came back up each time. When we walked outside with our diving suits, the ocean's noise surrounded me, and I nearly shuddered from how cold it was. It doesn't matter if the suits kept us dry. There was no way to fully stop the cold temperatures at these depths. Still, though, rather than reaching our assigned spots, we made it to the drop-off point, where a crane was lowering the new drill. We soon found it, and got to work setting it up. It didn't take much time to do that, considering we were listening to James's clear instructions, and he could see everything we were doing from the cameras in our suits. So we installed it pretty quickly. Once we were done, James spoke on the radio. "Well done. Now get away," he demanded, and we did as he said, before the drill started up. Loud doesn't even begin to describe what was going on as it began to drill into the seafloor, connecting to a separate line we already set up in preparation for the new drilling operation. We needed to stay and make sure everything was working fine, as James wanted to make sure that we were there to handle any mistakes. As far as I could tell, it worked just fine, and we were receiving reports of hitting more of the oil deposit. Then, a new sound came from the drill. I wasn't expecting to hear the drill groan against the seabed, but I did hear it struggle to break through something until it stopped entirely. Before we had time to react, the radio crackled. "Status report! The drill stopped!" James' voice nearly caused our ears to pop again from the pressure, and I grunted. "Monsieur James, I believe something is blocking the drill," Jean-Paul said, his voice sounding clearly as annoyed as ours. "That's apparent! Get over there and let me assess the damage from your cameras," James barked, and while I didn't like this attitude, I went over myself to take a look. Normally, when something like this happened, it would mean that where we drilled wasn't good enough to get more oil, so we'd likely have to get the drill repaired before we tried in another spot. The four of us surrounded the drill, and there was something odd as we approached. We heard a different noise. It sounded less like rocks breaking apart, and more like there was something in there that was alive. "Papo, there's something that's making a sonido that I don't know what it is, but it's no moving," Jose said, trying to tell James what was going on. "Then we're at the right spot," James responded, and we all looked at each other with confusion. "What do you mean we're at the right spot? There ain't no oil here," Jack said, and before James could respond, the drill started up again, moving even faster than before. I've heard a lot of different noises in my time working underwater, but this one was different. This one sounded like a scream. High-pitched, piercing, and clearly in pain. The sound was the least of our concerns, as the next thing that was coming out of the drill from where it was spinning was a red liquid. This wasn't any kind of oil we'd ever seen. and Jean-Paul screamed as he saw it. We had no choice but to return to the rig and the saturation chamber, and once we were dry, Jean-Paul started praying, and he kept repeating the same word over and over. Pitié, pitié, pitié. Each time he said it, he seemed even more scared. This was the same Jean-Paul who laughed when I heard wails and believed that through the power of his faith, there was nothing to fear. Yet here he was, saying mercy in French, over and over. Jack attended to him, and I went on the radio. "James, what was that?" I demanded, feeling my voice rise in frustration. "Mark, you're to take your team and return outside immediately," James said, as if nothing happened. Jean-Paul sobbed as he heard that. "Non, monsieur, non, pitié, s'il vous plaît," Jean said, clearly upset and crying, and Jose got on the radio. "Oye, we no going back out there, no somos tontos, papo. You gotta tell us what happened, ahora," Jose shouted. "And if you ain't gonna tell us, then put August on the line. He's our boss, not you, boy," Jack shouted as he gripped his microphone, like it was James's neck, while his other was patting Jean-Paul, trying to settle him down. "Enough," August's voice spoke through the microphone, offering us a sense of relief that didn't last long. "Gentlemen, I understand that this operation is unorthodox, but you gotta get your butts back out there. If that drill fails, we can kiss our jobs goodbye." August's voice was low and somber, which was different from the usual fatherly tone we loved him for. We looked at each other like we just got a punch in the gut, and Jean-Paul spoke through the microphone. "Monsieur, non, l'enfer." He shuddered every word, and there was radio silence on the other side for around 30 seconds. Then the silence broke. "There you have it. You have your orders from your boss. Get back out there or I'll report you all for insubordination." James's voice echoed through our heads like a death sentence. Jean-Paul was inconsolable, so the rest of us suited up again. We didn't make it outside as the diving area showed the red liquid had completely surrounded the area, making it impossible to see. "James, the water's purely red. We won't be able to see what's going on if we go back in," I said, and a minute later I heard James again. "Fine, return to the bell and take that sniveling coworker with you," James said, and when we returned to Jean-Paul, he was already begging the bellman to take us back to the surface. Despite the red ocean water that covered our view and made Jean-Paul close his eyes as he cried, we made it to the top without any issues, and James and August were waiting for us, both looking disappointed. Before anything could happen, Jean-Paul broke down and started sobbing in front of both men. August exchanged his disappointment for compassion as he tried to console Jean-Paul, before the rest of us glared at James, who was as cool as a cucumber. "Tell us what that was, now," I said, barely able to keep my anger in check, and James sighed at us. "Look, you're nothing more than welders. I just can't give away confidential information about a company operation to—" I interrupted his words by slamming him against the wall, holding him up by his collar. "Mark, stop!" August shouted, but he couldn't do anything to stop me. "No!" I growled, glaring at James. "I need to know. Now, tell me everything or I swear I'm taking you down there myself," I said, my hands trembling with rage as I held James. James looked at me as though I were some bug, not even afraid that I was threatening him, and he shook his head. "My father is dying." His voice came out almost like a robot's, and I gasped, with August looking down, almost as if he was accepting his fate. "What we were drilling down there is necessary to save his life and the lives of millions of people," he explained, and I let him get back on his feet. "Fine, so you're getting some kind of medicine, but what was that red stuff?" I asked, and the other guys looked at him. "It was blood, you idiot," he declared, not even flinching as he said it. "Blood from what?" I shouted, looking at him. "You're not going to believe me if I explain." He was trying to avoid telling me. "Yeah? Try me." "Fine, let me go and I'll tell you." As much as I wanted to knock his teeth out, I let him stand on his own feet. He fixed up his collar like he was putting it back on before he looked at us. "There's a specific fungus that grows beneath the seabed. It has proliferated over thousands of years and does so by feeding on the fauna in the seabed. This site was originally created due to a high concentration of the fungus in the area, but the local oil deposit made the company change direction, James explained. Furthermore, the fungus itself can sometimes capture the bodies of those who have fallen into the ocean and sunk to those depths. It can preserve their bodies and feed on them. When this fungus is combined with human blood, it can create a fluid that not only cures almost all conditions, but prevents further ones. The screaming you heard is nothing more than the fungus using the voice box of a dead person. Each word he spoke sent chills down her spine, and Jean-Paul sobbed as the explanation finished. That doesn't explain why the entire area was flooded with blood to the point where we can't see anything down there. My voice rose in anger with each syllable. That's why we found the right spot. The Gulf is no stranger to sunken burials at sea for religious, criminal, or colonial reasons. We didn't just find a good enough deposit until now, James coolly explained. I shook my head. You know what? No. Forget all this. I'm not messing with dead bodies, even if it does create some miracle cure, I said, and the other guys, except August and Jean-Paul, nodded with me. James shrugged. Suit yourself. Workers like yourself are a dime a dozen, but there's no way to cure my father's cancer unless we get more of this fluid, to say nothing of the others who will be denied life-saving medicine due to your refusal to work, James said, as if he were negotiating. I turned to look at August, who was looking down, clearly upset about this, and the other guys and I just looked at each other, trying to come to terms with what just happened and what we should do next. It wasn't long until Jose, Jack, and I decided to stay. Jean-Paul quit, and that was the last I heard of him. I don't know if he went back to Haiti or found somewhere else to live, but I do remember the prayer he left for us, almost as if he was asking God to save us from the devil himself. We continued working for as long as we could. Another drill came down, and the same screaming happened. More blood, more drills, more wailing that haunted our nightmares. This continued for months. Our 2 weeks off each month didn't feel like rest. There was the immediate relief of us reaching the mainland, but the dread of returning there hung over us. We stayed as a 3-man crew because we all knew too much, and James didn't want to risk any more potential leaks with Jean-Paul gone. Jack stopped cooking barbecue, and Jose tried to avoid nightmares by drinking more of his coffee to stay awake. On a return trip to the oil rig, Jack, Jose, and I didn't say anything to each other, but we did see James as he arrived. Normally, August was there to greet us too, but he was missing. His health had taken a turn for the worse recently, and the other rig workers confirmed he had gone to the hospital. We kept silent as we acclimated to the pressure in the saturation chamber, and made our way outside once we were ready. There were drill holes as far as the eye could see, each of them representing a place where we had dug into. I didn't dare look into these craters, but I did notice more shrimp and crab enter these craters, likely using them as their new homes. The one thing that I wished I noticed sooner was that there was nothing coming out. We had set up to drill to find more colonies, and it was supposed to be another day. That's when I heard another scream. It didn't come from the fungus. It came from Jack. "Something's grabbing me! It's pulling me!" His voice was a far cry from the usual tough Texan accent we all knew him for. I heard my heart in my ears. I had made my way over to his location. I saw him using his welding torch as a weapon at the growth that was dragging him towards one of the open craters, and while the growth screamed, it didn't let him go. Jose showed up right after, and we both pulled Jack as best as we could, hoping that we would have the strength to hold on until he was finished defending himself. According to the footage that we saw afterwards, it only took a minute to pull Jack free, but it felt like hours as adrenaline pumped through us. Once he was free, the growth receded into the crater, before more screaming from all the others began to dominate the soundscape around us, and we ran back into the saturation chamber as fast as we could until we reached inside. We were completely ignoring James and his demands for us to return out there, and made our way to the bell. The bellman took us up without question. Once we were back above water, James ran into the room. "What are you all doing? We haven't met today's quota!" At least, I'm sure that's what he said. Jack was still in shock, so he couldn't hear anything. Jose was muttering in Spanish, probably swearing at James or at what just happened, and I was still catching my breath when James was glaring at us. "Well?" he asked, like he was some teacher. "James, the fungus was moving. It nearly took Jack with it into one of those dig sites!" I said, matching his own glare. That's impossible. The camera showed no evidence of that, James said. Jack looked up at him with anger. Y'all can't be serious. There's more than just some fungus down there. His voice echoed with fear and rage. Yeah, and I don't care if August is in the hospital. You can tell him I quit, I said, too angry to care about my job anymore. Then James did something I never thought I'd see a man do before he told us what he did. He shrugged. If you mean my father, he's dead. Passed away around the time Jack started screaming. My eyes stung with tears. What? I asked. My voice lost volume as I said that word, before I grabbed James by the shoulders and pushed him against the wall. Then what about the medicine? Didn't you say that's why we were doing this? I cried out, tears flowing from anger. James just looked at me like I was a child having a tantrum. He couldn't afford it, James said, just like you won't be able to afford anything once you quit. But I'll give you one more chance. Let me go and head back down there, and I'll let this end with a write-up. Otherwise, pick up your tools and leave. I let James go and walked to Jose and Jack, shaking my head at them. We can't stay here, I said, and the other guys nodded. James scoffed. As you wish. I'll terminate your contracts immediately and inform the company of your lack of professionalism, James declared, and the guys and I just walked out. Fortunately, a helicopter was on the rig, dropping off another crew, so we were able to hitch a ride back. Naturally, we had to move out of our apartments in Fort Myers since the company subsidized them, but it wasn't a rough move. I still had my connections, and my family name carried weight, so I was still able to find a stable income. Jose had family back in Miami that would support him, and Jack went back to Texas. I can't say if the company ever unveiled the drug, or if they're still digging down there. I couldn't live with myself if the story didn't get out to the other oil rig workers. Please, if you find yourself in this situation, don't stay there. I still don't know what was down there, and I don't ever want to find out. I still hear the screams in my nightmares. My name is Danny, and I've been working on offshore oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico for 15 years. In that time, I've seen equipment failure that could kill a man in seconds, storms that turn 100-ton platforms into toys, and accidents that haunt me to this day. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I encountered on Deepwater Atlas during the summer of 2019. When I first started working offshore, the safety protocols were drilled into me harder than any bit ever drilled into bedrock. Every head count mattered. Every drill, every emergency alarm, every shift change. If one man was missing, the whole rig froze until he was found. Lives depended on it. The Gulf doesn't forgive mistakes, and a missing worker could mean someone was unconscious from gas exposure, fallen overboard, or trapped in machinery. In an environment where hydrogen sulfide can kill you in minutes and a single spark can turn the entire platform into a fireball, accounting for every soul isn't just policy, it's survival. I joined the crew of a rig as a maintenance technician in June. The rig was a massive, semi-submersible platform, housing 94 workers during peak operations. She was positioned about 180 miles southeast of New Orleans, drilling in waters so deep you couldn't see the bottom even on the clearest of days. The crew was a mix of seasoned roughnecks and college-educated engineers, but we all shared the same respect for the ocean's power and the rig's dangers. My supervisor was a weathered Texan named Carl, who'd been working offshore since the early 80s. Carl ran a tight ship, every tool accounted for, every safety protocol followed to the letter. He'd seen too many good men die from carelessness to tolerate even minor infractions. During my first week, he pulled me aside after the evening head count. Son, he said, tobacco juice staining from the corner of his mouth, I've been doing this for 37 years, and I can count every man on this rig in my sleep, but lately something's been off with the numbers. I figured he was testing me somehow, seeing if I'd picked up on some safety issue I'd missed. What kind of problem, sir? Carl looked out at the dark water surrounding us, the rig's lights reflecting off the waves like fallen stars. During evening roll call, I keep counting one more man than the roster shows. Just one. Not two, not five, always exactly one extra. At first, I thought it was fatigue. 12-hour shifts in the Gulf heat could mess with anyone's mind. The combination of physical exhaustion, irregular sleep activities, and the constant stress of working above thousands of feet of black water took its toll on even the most experienced hands. But as the weeks passed, I started noticing it too. During the 6 p.m. head count, Carl would gather us on the main deck, clipboard in hand, calling out the names alphabetically. Anderson, Boudreaux, Penn, Daniels, all the way through to Williams and Young. 94 names on the roster. But when Carl did his visual count, pointing at each man as he tallied, he always came up with 95. 93, 94, 95, he'd mutter, then recount. Same result. He'd check his clipboard, verify the roster, count again. The math never added up. Other supervisors started reporting the same discrepancy. During shift changes, emergency drills, and routine safety briefings, the head counts consistently showed one extra man, sometimes standing near the back of the group, coveralls stained with the same grime we all carried, hard hat pulled low over his face, always blending in perfectly with the rest of us. But when names were called, no one answered to that 95th person. First time I saw him clearly was during a fire routine drill in late July. The alarm had sounded at 2 a.m., standard procedure to test our response times when most of the crew was asleep. We stumbled out of our quarters in various states of dress, grabbing hard hats and life jackets, assembling at the designated muster point on the port side of the rig. As we lined up, I counted the familiar faces around me. Johnson from Louisiana, Martinez from Texas, O'Brien from Ireland, who never stopped talking about the weather back home. But there, at the edge of the group, where the rig's lights cast longer shadows, stood someone I didn't recognize. He wore the same orange coveralls we all did, the same white hard hat with reflective tape, the same steel-toed boots, but something was off about his posture. Too still, too rigid, like a doll positioned by someone who had never seen how real people stand. His face remained hidden behind the brim of his helmet, and when the ocean breeze that constantly swept the platform moved everyone else's coveralls, his remained perfectly still. I nudged at Martinez, who was standing next to me. "Hey, who's the new guy?" I pointed toward the figure, but when I looked back, he was gone. Not walked away, not moved to another position, simply absent, as if he had never been there at all. The drill concluded with Carl's usual count discrepancy. 94 names on the roster, 95 bodies accounted for. When he asked if anyone had seen the extra worker, a few hands went up tentatively. Descriptions varied. Some said he was tall, others average height. Some remembered dark coveralls, others swore they were the standard orange. The only consistent detail was that no one could recall his face. Management's response was predictable. Faulty logs, human error, optical illusions created by fatigue and artificial lighting. The rig safety coordinator, a company man named Peterson, who'd never worked a day on an actual drilling platform, dismissed the reports with bureaucratic efficiency. He suggested we implement a buddy system for head counts and recommended additional rest periods to combat what he called shift-related stress hallucinations. But the experienced hands knew better, because the accident started right after that. At first, they were minor incidents that could be chalked up to normal offshore hazards. Tools went missing from secure storage, only to be found in dangerous locations. Like a wrench left on a catwalk where it could fall on someone below, or a gas detector placed near a high-pressure line where a leak might go undetected. Safety equipment appeared in the wrong configurations. Harnesses with subtle cuts in the webbing that wouldn't be noticed until they were under load. Hard hats with cracked shells that would provide no protection in an impact. Then came the near misses. A valve was partially left open on a pressurized line, only discovered when a technician noticed unusual gauge readings during routine inspection. A safety rail on the upper deck was found loose, its bolts backed out just enough to give way under weight. Emergency lighting in a critical corridor failed during a night shift, leaving workers to navigate in darkness around dangerous machinery. The pattern became impossible to ignore when Jake, a driller from Alabama with 20 years of experience, took a fall from the drilling platform. Jake was legendary for his attention to detail and to safety. He was the kind of worker who double-checked every harness clip and never took shortcuts, no matter how routine the task. His equipment was inspected after the incident. Harness in perfect condition, safety line properly secured, all protocols followed exactly. But Jake swore that someone had brushed past him on the narrow catwalk just before he lost his balance. A firm shoulder contact that shifted his weight at the worst possible moment sent him over the rail. He managed to catch himself on a lower platform, suffering only bruised ribs and a dislocated shoulder that could have easily been a fatal plunge into the water. When we reviewed the security footage, the incident was clearly visible. Jack was walking along the catwalk, suddenly lurching sideways, grabbing for the rail as he fell. But the moment of contact he described was obscured by a strange blur in the recording, a distortion that made it impossible to see what, if anything, had caused him to stumble. The timestamp showed the exact moment when our evening head count had registered 95 workers instead of 94. I started keeping detailed records, documenting every discrepancy in a notebook I carried in my coveralls. Date, time, location, weather conditions, and descriptions from anyone who claimed to see the extra worker. The pattern that emerged was undeniable. Whenever the mysterious 95th man appeared during head counts, accidents followed within 24 hours. A gas leak in the pump room discovered just before it reached explosive concentration, a crane cable that snapped under load, sending a half-ton pipe section crashing into the deck inches from where two workers had been standing moments before. A fire in the galley that started when a seemingly functional stove suddenly began leaking propane, filling the enclosed space with invisible death until someone's cigarette lighter nearly turned the kitchen into a bomb. Each incident was preceded by sightings of the extra worker, always silent, always watching, never speaking or responding to direct contact. Workers started seeing him in peripheral vision, standing at the end of a corridor, observing from an upper platform, present in their workspace when they arrived, but gone when they turned for a second look. The most disturbing encounters happened during night shifts, when the rig's skeleton crew worked under harsh artificial lighting that created deep shadows between the illuminated areas. Workers reported feeling watched, sensing presence in empty spaces, hearing footsteps that didn't match their own movement patterns. The figure appeared most often during routine maintenance tasks, standing just outside of the range of work lights, observing activities with an attention that felt predatory rather than curious. There was a welder named Frank who had the most unsettling encounter. He was working alone in the lower equipment bay, replacing corroded fittings on a seawater intake line. The work required him to crawl into a confined space barely large enough for his body and tools, with his legs protruding out into the main walkway. "I heard footsteps," Frank told me later, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by obvious fear. "Heavy boots on metal deck plating, getting closer. I called out, thinking maybe someone needed to get past, but no answer. The steps stopped right next to my legs." Frank tried to back out of the confined space to see who was there, but something was preventing his movement. Not physically holding him, but creating resistance like he was pushing against a strong current. I could feel something standing there, looking down at me, cold, like standing in front of an open freezer. But when I finally got loose and looked up, nothing. Nobody there. When Frank returned to complete his work the next day, he discovered that the fittings he'd been replacing had been cross-threaded during installation, a mistake that would have caused a high-pressure leak within hours of the system being pressurized. He swore the threads had been properly aligned when he'd stopped work, but the evidence suggested otherwise. After 3 months of these incidents, I decided to confront Carl directly. I found him in his office after the evening shift, reviewing maintenance logs by the light of a desk lamp. The rig's constant mechanical humming provided a background soundtrack that almost all of us had learned to ignore. But in the small, enclosed space, it felt oppressive. "Carl, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." He looked up from his paperwork, eyes red with fatigue. "Shoot." "Do you really believe that there's an extra man on this rig?" Carl leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. For a long moment, he didn't speak, just stared at the coffee stain on his desk blotter that had been there since I'd arrived. When he finally answered, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Danny, I've worked on 17 different rigs in my career. I've seen men die from accidents that should have never happened, and I've seen others walk away from situations that should have killed them. I've learned to trust my instincts about danger, even when I can't explain why something feels wrong." He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with handwritten entries. "I started keeping track 3 years ago when this first started happening. Not just here. Other platforms, other crews, the pattern's always the same. Extra worker appears in head counts, accidents increase. Sometimes it's a minor incident, sometimes people die." "What do you think it is?" I asked him. Carl shrugged, closing the notebook. Hell, I don't know. Ghost of someone who died out here? Some kind of warning system the ocean created? Could be we're all losing our minds from too much time breathing recycled air. All I know for certain is this. When the numbers don't add up, people get hurt. And the worker we can't identify is somehow connected to it. He leaned forward, his expression serious. I'm going to give you the same advice I've given the other supervisors. Don't follow him. Don't try to confront him. Don't investigate. When you see something that doesn't make sense, walk away. Document it if you want, but keep your distance. Why? I asked. Because the one time I tried to get in a close look, 3 men nearly died in the explosion that happened the next day. The most significant event occurred on a Thursday night in early September. I was working the late shift, conducting routine inspections of the emergency shutdown systems that could stop drilling operations in case of a dangerous pressure buildup. The work took me to the lower levels of the rig, where the constant noise of pumps and generators created an industrial symphony that masked other sounds. Around 2 a.m., the gas detection alarms began sounding, a piercing electronic wail that potentially meant lethal concentrations of hydrogen sulfide had been detected somewhere on the platform. Within seconds, the general alarm joined in, creating a cacophony that could be heard for miles across the dark gulf. Emergency protocols kicked in automatically, ventilation systems activated to clear potentially contaminated air, non-essential electrical systems shut down to prevent ignition sources, and the crew began evacuation procedures to move everyone to safe areas upwind of any leaks. I was making my way towards the muster point when I saw him. The extra worker was standing at the far end of Corridor C, motionless in the flashing red emergency lights that bathed everything in this dark illumination. Same coveralls, same helmet, face hidden in shadow as always. But this time, instead of observing from a distance, he was positioned directly in my evacuation route. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached, gas detector in one hand, emergency radio in another. Emergency procedure called for everyone to evacuate immediately, but something about his presence felt important, like he was trying to communicate something critical. "Hey!" I shouted over the alarm noise. "You need to get to the muster point! This isn't a drill!" He didn't respond, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. Instead, he turned slowly, like a mechanical device operating on failing batteries, and walked towards the sealed maintenance hatch at the end of the corridor. I followed, though every instinct and Carl's advice had told me to head to safety. The hatch led to a confined space that had been welded shut years earlier after being deemed unnecessary for the operations on the rig. The welds were solid, the metal painted over multiple times. There was no way to open it without cutting equipment. The figure stopped in front of the hatch and simply stood there, as if waiting for something. I approached cautiously, my gas detector clicking more rapidly as I drew near, indicating increasing concentration of dangerous gases. When I was close enough to touch him, he directly looked at me. I still can't adequately describe what I saw. It wasn't a face, more like the suggestion of facial features glimpsed through heavy fog. Eyes that reflected like an animal's, but with no color or depth. A mouth that might have been speaking, but produced no sound. Features that shifted when I tried to focus on them, as if looking at something underwater. He raised one arm, covered in coveralls identical to mine, and pointed at the sealed hatch. He then stepped forward and disappeared directly through the solid metal, like walking through an open doorway. I stood frozen for several seconds, trying to process what I'd witnessed. The gas detector in my hand was clicking rapidly now, its needle approaching the red zone that indicated immediately dangerous concentrations. Whatever was behind the hatch was the source of the leak. Training took over. I radioed the emergency coordinator, reporting the location of the gas source and requesting immediate attention from the hazmat team. A few minutes later, workers arrived with cutting torches and forced entry tools, opening the sealed space I'd seen the figure go into. Gas hissed out from under pressure, a mix of hydrogen sulfide with methane that could have killed anyone in the confined space within minutes. If the concentration had continued building, the entire lower level would have become uninhabitable, forcing evacuation of the rig and potentially causing a catastrophic release when the gas found an ignition source. The source was a corroded fitting on an abandoned service line that should have been completely isolated. Somehow, pressure had built up in the supposedly empty system, creating a leak where no one would normally look until it was too late. After the emergency was contained, I reviewed the security footage from the corridor. The camera showed me walking down the hallway, stopping in front of the sealed hatch, and radioing for help. But they didn't show anyone else. Not the figure I followed, not the person who had led me to discover the gas leak. The timestamp confirmed that 95 workers had been counted during the previous shift change, but the man I'd encountered wasn't visible on any recording. The official incident report credited me with discovering the leak during routine inspection. My supervisors commended my vigilance and attention to safety protocols. But I knew the truth. Without the extra workers' intervention, that gas buildup could have killed dozens of people when it eventually found an ignition source. I left the rig 2 weeks later, transferring to a platform closer to shore where the head counts always matched the roster exactly. But the extra workers' story didn't end with my departure. Through the network of offshore workers who move between rigs throughout the Gulf, I've continued hearing similar reports. A figure in coveralls who appears during head counts but isn't on any personnel list, accidents that follow sightings of unexplained workers, incidents prevented by mysterious interventions that can't be documented or explained. Sometimes, the encounters end tragically. A crew in the Permian Basin reported seeing an extra worker for weeks before a blowout killed 11 men. Workers on a platform off Louisiana described similar sightings before a helicopter crash that claimed 4 lives. The pattern suggests that while the figure sometimes warns of danger, he can't always prevent the disasters he predicts. Other times, like my experience with the gas leak, the encounters serve as warnings that save lives. Workers have reported being led away from dangerous areas just before accidents, finding safety in unexpected places during emergencies, and discovering hazards that would have gone undetected until they became fatal. To this day, I don't know if he's a ghost, a guardian spirit, or something the ocean itself created to watch over the lives of thousands of workers who still risk everything to extract resources beneath the waves. All I know for certain is that the extra worker still appears on rigs throughout the Gulf and beyond, showing up in head counts where his presence defies explanation. Different platforms, different crews, same story. Always one more man than the roster indicates, and whenever he appears, the mathematics of survival become more complicated than simple addition and subtraction. So if you ever find yourself working offshore and the head count doesn't match the personnel list, pay attention. Don't dismiss it as fatigue or counting errors, because sometimes the person who isn't supposed to be there is the only thing standing between you and disaster. And if you see him, really see him, standing in the shadows where the lights don't reach, listen to what he's trying to tell you. He may not speak, but his message is always the same. Somewhere on the platform, death is preparing to collect its due. Some workers never clock out. They just keep working, shift after shift, trying to prevent the accidents they couldn't avoid in life. The extra worker is one of them, and his presence in your head count might mean that someone might not make it home. My name is Marcus, and I've been a mechanical systems engineer for 12 years, specializing in offshore climate control and environmental systems. I've worked platforms from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arabian Sea, but nothing in my education or experience prepared me for what I encountered in the North Sea during the winter of 2021. When engineers design offshore platforms, heating and cooling systems are standardized down to the smallest detail. Every section, every cabin, every corridor maintains the same temperature within a narrow range, typically between 68 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The systems are redundant, monitored continuously, and designed to function in the harshest marine environments imaginable. Temperature control isn't just about comfort, it's about survival. In the North Sea, where winter storms can drop air temperatures to -20 and winds can reach hurricane force, a failed heating system means death within hours. But what happens when the instruments show readings that no reservoir could ever produce, readings from wells that were never meant to be drilled? I joined the crew of this oil rig in November, brought in to upgrade the platform's aging HVAC systems during a scheduled maintenance period. The rig was a massive semi-submersible platform positioned 150 miles northeast of Aberdeen, extracting natural gas from deposits beneath the seabed. It housed 127 workers, so the platform was essentially a small city floating in some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. The crew chief who briefed me was a Scottish engineer named Ian McLeod, a veteran of North Sea operations who'd worked offshore for over 20 years. During my first week, he walked me through the platform's climate control infrastructure, a complex network of heating units, ventilation ducts, and temperature sensors that maintained livable conditions throughout the massive structure. The North Sea doesn't forgive mistakes, Ian told me as we inspected the central control room where all environmental systems were monitored. Temperature regulation fails out here, and people die. That's why we over-engineer everything, maintain multiple backups, and check the systems twice daily. The control room was impressive. Banks of monitors displaying real-time temperature readings from every section of the platform, automatic alerts for any deviation from normal parameters, and backup controls that could override any malfunctioning unit. Everything was color-coded, clearly labeled, and designed for immediate response to any environmental emergency. But a month into my contract, strange complaints started filtering through the maintenance requests. It began with cabin 14B, two-person quarters on the lower residential deck. Tommy, a driller from Liverpool, reported that his cabin was freezing cold despite the thermostat showing normal temperature. He and his roommate, a Norwegian roughneck named Eric, swore that they could see their breath inside the cabin even when the heating system indicated it was maintaining the standard 70-degree temperature. When I investigated personally, the situation was exactly as it was described. The air in cabin 14B was cold enough to fog my breath, probably around 45 degrees Fahrenheit based on my experience, but every system check came back normal. The thermostat read 70 degrees. The heating unit was functioning properly, blowing warm air through the vents. The insulation showed no signs of damage on air leaks. According to every instrument I had, the cabin should have at least been perfectly comfortable. I ran diagnostics on the heating unit, checked the ductwork, tested the thermostat calibration, and even brought in thermal imaging equipment to look over heat loss through the walls. Everything functioned exactly as designed. The heating system was delivering the correct amount of warm air, the cabin was properly insulated, and there were no obvious sources of heat loss. Yet the actual temperature remained uncomfortably cold. Just 2 corridors over, I encountered the opposite problem. Cabin 16A was reported as unbearably hot, while the occupants, 2 welders from Texas named Roberts and Martinez, complaining that they were sweating through their uniforms despite keeping the thermostat at its lowest setting. When I entered their cabin, the heat hit me like I was opening an oven door. The air was stifling, probably in the mid-80s, making it difficult to breathe comfortably. Again, all the systems checked out perfectly. The cooling system was operating normally, circulating air at the correct temperature and volume. The thermostat showed 70 degrees. There were no obvious heat sources, no faulty electrical equipment, no solar heating through windows, no problems with the ventilation system. Yet the actual temperature was high enough to cause heat exhaustion. Within weeks, more reports came in from throughout the platform. Workers described encountering pockets of extreme temperature that defied every logical explanation. Sections of the corridors where the air temperature dropped so suddenly that condensation formed on exposed metal surfaces. Stairwells where the handrails became too hot to touch safely, requiring workers to use gloves when climbing between decks. The pattern was both random and consistent. Random in the affected areas that seemed to have no relationship to the platform's mechanical systems, but consistent in that the same locations repeatedly showed temperature anomalies despite all equipment functioning normally. I documented every complaint, ran comprehensive diagnostics on all affected areas, and even brought in specialists from the platform's engineering contractor to examine the systems. Every test, every measurement, every analysis showed identical equipment performing identically throughout the platform. There were no mechanical failures, no design flaws, no installation errors that could account for the temperature variations. That's when I started researching the platform's history, hoping to find some explanation in the construction, in its records, or in its previous maintenance logs. What I discovered changed everything I thought I understood about the situation. So this rig had been constructed in 2019, but it wasn't the first platform to operate in this exact location. The original platform had operated here from 1987 to 2001 before being decommissioned due to structural fatigue and replaced with newer technology. Before this one, there had been two earlier platforms dating back to the 1970s, lost to accidents that claimed multiple lives. I cross-referenced the temperature anomaly locations with historical records from the previous platforms, using archived blueprints and incident reports that I requested from the Norwegian Petroleum Authority and the UK Health and Safety Executive. The correlation was impossible to ignore. Cabin 14B corresponded exactly to the location where a maintenance worker named Thomas had died during a blizzard evacuation from the original 1970s platform. Thomas had been trapped in his quarters when the evacuation helicopter couldn't return due to storm conditions. He was found 3 days later, frozen to death when the platform's heating system failed during the emergency. Cabin 16A matched the positions where a galley fire on the previous platform had killed two workers in 1994. The fire had started in the kitchen's deep fryer and spread rapidly throughout the dining area, trapping the men in a room that became a furnace before emergency teams could reach them. Every anomalous zone aligned with locations where fatal accidents had occurred on the previous platforms. A stairwell that now became unbearably hot corresponded to where an electrical fire had killed an engineer back in '83. A corridor section that dropped to near freezing temperatures matched the site where three workers had died of hypothermia during a platform evacuation back in '91. Different platforms, different decades, but somehow the locations of past tragedies were manifesting environmental anomalies on the current structure. It was as if the coordinates themselves retained some memory of the deaths that had occurred there, translating historical trauma into present-day physical phenomena. I ran thermal imaging scans during the night shifts when fewer people were moving around the platform, hoping to get cleaner readings of the temperature variations. The results were both scientifically fascinating and deeply unsettling. The thermal cameras picked up distinct hot and cold temperatures in the anomalous zones, but not random temperature variations. Instead, they showed clearly defined human-shaped thermal patterns. In the cold zones, the cameras detected warm silhouettes, roughly person-sized and shaped, standing motionless in corridors and leaning against door frames. In the hot zones, the opposite appeared. Cold human-shaped shadows surrounded by areas of intense heat. The thermal signatures weren't moving randomly or shifting like normal heat patterns would. They maintained consistent human postures, standing upright, arms at their sides, heads turned as if looking down corridors or into rooms. Some appeared to be sitting, others walking in slow, regular patterns that suggested purposeful movements rather than random thermal fluctuations. During one late-night inspection, I discovered something even more disturbing. The thermal signatures appeared to be aware of my presence. As I moved through the affected areas with my handheld thermal camera, the heat patterns would shift orientation, as if turning to watch me pass. When I stopped to take detailed readings, additional signatures would appear, clustering around my position like an invisible crowd gathering to observe. The crew began avoiding the affected areas whenever possible. Workers requested transfers to different cabins, maintenance teams refused assignments in the anomalous zones, and the night shift reported feeling constantly watched in the corridors where thermal anomalies were the strongest. Several workers complained of physical sensations, feeling cold hands touch them in the hot zones, experiencing sudden temperature changes that left them disoriented and nauseous. James, an electrician from Glasgow, had the most disturbing encounter. He was working alone in a maintenance room that corresponded to where a worker had died in a hydrogen sulfide leak during the '80s. The room had been showing extreme cold readings for weeks, with ice forming on the interior walls despite the heating system running constantly. I was replacing a circuit breaker when I felt someone standing behind me, James reported. Cold, like someone had opened a freezer door right behind my back. I turned around and there was nobody there, but I could see my breath suddenly, like the temperature had dropped 30 degrees in a second. James finished his work as quickly as possible, but as he was leaving, he felt what he described as a freezing hand grip his arm just above the elbow. The sensation was so intense that it left a mark, a handprint-shaped area of frostbite that required medical treatment. The incident occurred in a room where the instruments showed the temperature was a steady 72 degrees Fahrenheit. I filed comprehensive reports with platform management, documenting the temperature anomalies, the correlation with historical accidents, and the thermal imaging evidence. The response was predictable corporate dismissal, crew hysteria caused by prolonged offshore duty, environmental stress reactions, instruments calibration errors due to extreme weather conditions. But the incidents continued escalating. Workers began reporting physical symptoms that couldn't be explained by normal environmental factors. Heat exhaustion in areas that measured cool, frostbite in areas that instruments showed as warm, respiratory problems that correlated with the thermal anomaly zones regardless of actual air quality measurements. Platform's medical officer, Dr. Sarah, documented cases that defied medical explanation. Workers arriving in the infirmary with symptoms of hypothermia despite having worked in areas where the environmental systems showed normal heating. Others with heat stroke and dehydration after working in sections that registered as properly air-conditioned. I've treated environmental exposure for 15 years, Dr. Sarah told me during a private conversation. These symptoms are real, not psychological, but they don't match the environmental condition these workers were exposed to, according to our instruments. It's like their bodies were reacting to temperatures that don't exist on our monitoring systems. The breaking point came during a severe North Sea storm in early February. Winds reached 80 miles per hour, with waves tall enough to wash over the lower decks. The platform systems were stressed to their limits, with power fluctuations causing multiple equipment failures throughout the structure. I was conducting emergency inspections of critical systems when alarms began blaring from the lower maintenance level. The environmental control room was showing multiple temperature alerts from an area that had been previously stable, a corridor section that led me to the platform's emergency generator room. When I reached the affected area, the conditions were unlike anything I had encountered. The air was so cold it felt like walking into a deep freezer. My breath formed thick clouds of condensation that lingered in the still air. Frost was actively forming on the walls, spreading across the metal surfaces like living ice. The temperature was impossible. According to my handheld instruments, the temperature was below freezing, probably around 20 degrees Fahrenheit. But the corridor's heating system was running at full capacity, and the central environmental controls showed normal temperature readings. The physical evidence contradicted every measurement. As I moved deeper into the corridor, documenting the impossible conditions with my thermal camera, that's where I saw him. A man in coveralls stood at the far end of the hallway, motionless in the dim emergency lighting. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with a blue tinge that suggested severe hypothermia. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring straight ahead without blinking. Frost covered his hair and clothing. When he exhaled, no breath was visible, despite the sub-freezing air. I called out, asking if he needed assistance, but received no response. As I approached, the cold intensified until it felt like knives cutting through my insulated coveralls. The man remained perfectly still, watching me with those vacant, ice-glazed eyes. When I was close enough to touch him, he raised one frost-covered hand and whispered in a voice like the wind, with frozen rigging. The lights surged and flickered. Suddenly, intense heat slammed through the corridor like the blast from a furnace. The frost on the walls began melting instantly, causing steam that filled the air with scalding vapor. The metal surfaces became too hot to touch safely, and the air temperature spiked from below freezing to over 100 degrees within seconds. I stumbled backwards, half frozen from the initial cold and then burning from the sudden heat. My thermal camera was recording wildly fluctuating readings as the corridor shifted between extremes. The alarms were screaming, emergency lights were strobing, and the environmental systems were struggling to compensate for conditions that shouldn't have been possible. I made it to the stairwell and collapsed, my body trying to process the physiological shock of the rapid temperature changes. When I looked back down the corridor, everything appeared normal. The emergency lighting was steady, the air temperature felt comfortable, and the environmental monitoring systems showed no anomalies. But my thermal camera told a different story. The recorded data showed dozens of human-shaped thermal signatures filling the corridor during my encounter. Hot figures standing in the initial cold zone, cold silhouettes surrounded by the burning heat that followed, all of them facing toward my position, as if watching my reaction to their presence. Thermal patterns weren't random or equipment related. They showed clear human forms in various states of distress, some standing upright as if frozen in place, others crouched or collapsed as if overcome by heat. The shapes suggested people in work clothes, with some having their arms raised, as if trying to shield themselves from environmental extremes. I left the rig when my contract ended 2 weeks later. The platform management had dismissed my reports as stress-related hallucinations, and continuing to work in an environment where my professional observations were considered symptoms of mental breakdown seemed pointless. My replacement was briefed only on the standard environmental systems, with no mention of the temperature anomalies or the correlations with historical accidents. Through contacts in the offshore industry, I've continued hearing reports from that rig and other North Sea platforms. Workers describe encountering inexplicable temperature variations that defy all mechanical explanation, environmental zones that shift between burning heat and bitter cold without any relationship to the climate control systems. Thermal imaging equipment detects human-shaped signatures in areas where no living person is present. The pattern extends beyond individual platforms to entire regions of offshore operations, areas of the North Sea where multiple platforms have operated for over decades now show higher incidence of environmental anomalies. Coordinates where serious accidents have occurred seem to retain some form of thermal memory, creating conditions that reflect the circumstances of past tragedies. Marine engineers working in the Gulf of Mexico report similar phenomena around platforms where blowouts or fires have killed workers. Rigs in the Arabian Sea document temperature zones that correlate with historical accident sites. The coordinates themselves seem to remember, translating past trauma into present-day environmental anomalies that affect current operations. I've developed a theory based on my operations and observations and research into reports from other locations. Offshore platforms don't just sit on the ocean. They absorb the experiences that occur within their structures. Every accident, every tragedy, every death leaves some form of imprint that persists even when the original platform is replaced. The environmental systems we designed to maintain life may also be maintaining something else. The thermal signatures of past trauma, the physical memory of deaths that occurred in those specific coordinates. The heating and cooling equipment that keeps current workers alive might also be preserving the final moments of those who died in previous operations. Maybe the dead don't rest easy when steel platforms are rebuilt over the coordinates where they died. Maybe their final experiences, the heat of burning fires, the bitter cold of emergency evacuations, continue to manifest through the very systems designed to prevent those tragedies. I still dream about the zones, walking through corridors that shift from burning to freezing in heartbeats, feeling the presence of workers who died decades before I was born, their final moments replaying through environmental systems that can't forget what happened in those exact locations. The thermal imaging equipment I carried that night recorded more than temperature variations. It documented the persistence of human suffering in coordinates where death occurred, translated into environmental conditions that current instruments can measure but can't explain. That platform continues operating in the North Sea, extracting resources from beneath some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. New workers arrive, experience the temperature anomalies, file reports that are dismissed as equipment malfunctions or stress reactions, and eventually accept that some aspects of offshore work can't be explained through conventional engineering. The environmental systems continue maintaining life for living while preserving the thermal memory of the dead. And in the coordinates where past tragedies occurred, the temperature zones persist, hot and cold signatures of human suffering that no amount of mechanical precision can regulate or control. Some experiences burn too deep to be forgotten, some cold cuts too sharp to ever be warmed, and some platforms remember everything that ever happened within their steel boundaries, maintaining those memories through the heating and cooling systems that keep their current occupants alive. If you ever find yourself working offshore, and the environmental readings don't match what your body is telling you, then trust your physical sensations over the instruments, because sometimes the most sophisticated climate control systems are maintaining more than comfortable working conditions. They're maintaining the final moments of everyone who ever died in those exact coordinates, preserved in the steel and circuitry and thermal memory that never fades. I'm glad I'm finally able to tell this story. I've tried sharing it with other people in the past, but nobody believes me. Hell, it's hard for me to believe it myself sometimes. Still, if I don't tell it, then that means it'll haunt me forever. Hopefully now, I can use this as a means of letting it go. My name is Ray, and I've been running supply boats in the Gulf of Mexico for 18 years. In that time, I've delivered everything from drilling mud to birthday cakes, Christmas decorations to emergency medical equipment. Every offshore platform depends on supply vessels like mine to survive. We're the lifeline that connects these isolated industrial cities to the mainland. On the open sea, supply ships are the crucial link for offshore platforms. We deliver everything: food, tools, equipment, you name it, everything that a rig needs to keep running. Every item is logged in triplicate, every request cross-checked against approved requisition lists, every manifest signed and countersigned by both delivery and receiving personnel. Paperwork is sacred in this business because when you're 200 miles from shore, missing supplies can mean the difference between routine operations and serious emergencies. But what happens when the orders don't make sense? What happens when a supply ship receives requests for equipment that hasn't existed for decades, from rig positions that official charts show as nothing but empty ocean? This is the story of the manifests I saw and how they nearly cost me my sanity. I worked for a helicopter charter company based in Louisiana that handled crew transport, cargo, and delivery for dozens of offshore platforms throughout the region. My aircraft was a 180-foot offshore supply vessel configured for mixed passenger and cargo operations with a range that could reach the deepest drilling sites in the Gulf. The company I worked for handled supply runs for dozens of platforms throughout the Gulf. Our dispatch center in Morgan City coordinated hundreds of deliveries quickly, tracking everything from 10,000-pound cement mixers to cases of hot sauce requested by specific rig cooks. The system was computerized, cross-referenced, and audited constantly to prevent theft, waste, or delivery errors. Everything was by the book, which is why the first unusual order caught my attention immediately. It was a Tuesday morning in March when I received the manifest that would change everything. Among the standard requests for drill pipe, safety equipment, and groceries was an item that made me do a double take. 20 rotary dial telephones, complete with installation hardware and vintage handsets. Not satellite phones, not digital communication equipment, not modern handsets. Rotary phones. The kinds with actual dials that you had to turn for each number, equipment that had been phased out of industrial use 30 years ago, at least. The manifest listed them as communication equipment standard issue, with a part number I didn't recognize and a requisition signature from someone named Morrison, who was a platform manager. I first laughed it off as a clerical error, figuring someone had pulled the wrong item code from an outdated catalog. But when I called the dispatch to verify, the response was a matter of fact: if it's in the system with proper authorization, you deliver it, no exceptions. The dispatcher, a woman named Janet who had been coordinating Gulf deliveries for over a decade, confirmed that the requisition was official, signed, stamped, and logged in the company computer system. The requesting platform was designated as GOM-47 with specific coordinates that was approximately 150 miles southeast of New Orleans. I checked the coordinates against my navigation charts. According to official records, that location showed open water, no active drilling platforms, no production facilities, no structures of any kind. But the manifest was legitimate, the signature was properly authorized, and Maritime Logistics had a strict policy about questioning customer requests. Platform positions change, Janet explained when I mentioned the coordinate discrepancy. They move these rigs around for different drillings. Your job is delivery, not navigation verification. So, I loaded the rotary phones along with the rest of the cargo and set course for the designated coordinate. The voyage out was routine until we reached the general area specified on the manifest. My GPS showed we were at the correct position, but there was nothing visible except the endless blue-green water of the deep Gulf. I circled the coordinates for an hour, scanning scanning the horizon through binoculars, checking and rechecking our position. Then, through the haze that perpetually hung over the Gulf waters, steel structures began emerging like a mirage, resolving into solid reality. First, the top of a derrick, then the outline of living quarters, then the complete superstructure of an offshore drilling platform, exactly where my navigation systems confirmed GOM-47 should be located. But something was wrong with the visual appearance. The platform looked older than most modern rigs I'd serviced. Weathered steel, faded paints, and an overall design that seemed to date from the 70s or early 80s. The helipad markings were correct, the docking approach was clear, and workers in coveralls were visible on the deck, preparing to receive my cargo. We tied up to the platform's supply dock, and I supervised the transfer of cargo while my first mate handled the manifest paperwork. The workers who came down to receive the supplies were polite but reserved, speaking only when necessary to coordinate the delivery. Their faces remained in shadow beneath their hard hats, and their voices carried an odd quality, muffled, as if they were speaking from inside closed rooms. The strangest part was their reaction to the rotary phones. While they handled the other cargo with normal efficiency, they treated the telephone crates with something approaching reverence, moving them carefully and immediately disappearing into the platform structure with them. When the delivery was complete, a figure in supervisor coveralls approached my first mate with the manifest clipboard. The signature was scrawled quickly, Morrison, platform manager, and the man stamped it with an official-looking seal before disappearing back into the platform without a word. As we prepared to depart, I took one last look around the platform, trying to understand what felt so wrong about the entire encounter. The rig appeared functional, the workers seemed competent, and the delivery had proceeded normally, but something in the atmosphere felt off, too quiet, too subdued, like a workplace where something terrible had recently happened. The return voyage to the port was uneventful, but when I submitted my delivery report, dispatch immediately questioned my account. "We went off course," Janet informed me over the radio. "There's no platform at those coordinates. GOM-47 is currently positioned 60 miles northeast of your reported location." I protested, showing her the completed manifest with Morrison's signature and the official platform stamp, but she insisted I had somehow delivered to the wrong location. But the manifest was signed, stamped, and properly completed. The cargo had been delivered, received, and accepted. Regardless of the coordinate confusion, the delivery had been successful according to every documentation requirement. Over the next few months, more unusual orders began appearing in my manifests. Obsolete drill bits designed for equipment that hadn't been manufactured since the 80s. Outdated safety harnesses that no longer met current Coast Guard requirements. Food brands that had been discontinued for decades. Cases of soft drinks with logos I remembered from my childhood. Canned goods with package designs that looked like museum pieces. Each strange requisition was tied to platform coordinates that showed as empty water on all official charts, yet each delivery to encounters with rigs that appeared solid and operational. The platforms varied in design and apparent age, but they all shared certain characteristics: older construction, weathered appearance, and crews that were polite but strangely reserved. I started comparing notes with other supply boat captains during our regular gatherings at the port. The conversations revealed that I wasn't alone in these experiences. Captain Mike, who'd been running Gulf Supplies for over 20 years, described delivering vintage diving equipment to a platform that appeared at coordinates where his charts showed a depth of 8,000 feet. Captain Susan reported regular deliveries of discontinued medical supplies to rigs that materialized in areas officially designed as environmentally sensitive zones where no drilling was permitted. But the worst came from Captain Bobby. He'd been working in the Gulf since the 70s. He maintained detailed records of every delivery and had begun cross-referencing the mysterious platform coordinates with historical maritime incident reports. "Every phantom rig matches the site of a lost platform," Captain Bobby told me during a quiet conversation at a seafood restaurant. "That platform you've been delivering to at those coordinates, that's where another rig burned in '73, and it killed 17 men." He showed me printouts from Coast Guard incident reports, Lloyd's maritime casualty records, and oil company disaster archives. Correlation was undeniable. Every set of coordinates where we'd encountered unexplained platforms matched the locations where offshore structures had been lost to fires, storms, explosions, or structural failures. One rig exploded in 1982, taking 43 lives. Another collapsed during a hurricane in 79. Yet another was destroyed by a gas blowout in 91 that killed dozens of workers. All corresponded to coordinates where supply boats had encountered platforms requesting obsolete equipment and discontinued supplies. One night, driven by morbid curiosity, I decided to test the phenomenon. I kept photocopies of several manifests signed by the mysterious platforms and researched the names that appeared as requisition authorities. Morrison, the platform manager who'd signed for the rotary phones, had been the actual manager of the platform that burned in 73. Campbell, who authorized a delivery of vintage safety equipment, had been the operations supervisor on the other one when it exploded, and Stevens, who had requisitioned discontinued medical supplies, had been aboard with the other one during the final explosion. All the signatures were from men who had died decades ago in the disasters that destroyed their platforms. The realization should have terrified me, but instead it created a strange sense of professional obligation. These platforms, or whatever they had become, were still requesting supplies, still maintaining some form of operation, still signing proper manifests. As a supply captain, my job was to deliver requested cargo to offshore installations, regardless of how unusual the circumstances might be. But the final incident that ended my involvement with these manifests occurred during a severe storm later that year. I received an emergency requisition for medical supplies, specifically burn treatment kits and trauma equipment that had been standard issue in the 70s but was now considered obsolete. The manifest indicated urgent delivery to coordinates that I recognized as the location of where one of the rig sites blew up. The storm made navigation treacherous, with 20-foot swells and sustained winds over 40 knots. Modern platforms would have suspended supply operations until conditions improved, but the requisition was marked as emergency priority, requiring immediate delivery regardless of weather conditions. We fought through the rough seas for 6 hours. My ship took a beating from the waves that occasionally washed over the deck. Lightning split the sky constantly, and the rain was so heavy that visibility dropped to near zero. Navigation was possible only through GPS and radar, as the storm made visual references impossible. When we finally reached the designated coordinates, the lightning illuminated what appeared to be a massive drilling platform riding out the storm. But something was wrong with the image. The platform seemed to flicker in and out of existence, solid during lightning flashes, but absent in the darkness between. Docking was nearly impossible in the heavy seas, but the emergency nature of the cargo demanded that we attempt delivery. As we fought to secure lines to the platform's supply dock, another lightning flash revealed the structure clearly. And then, in the distant darkness that follows, it vanished completely. We found ourselves tied to nothing but black water, our line stretching into an empty ocean. The platform had simply ceased to exist, leaving us anchored in coordinates where no structure stood. Then, in the next lightning flash, the platform reappeared exactly as before, solid, towering, riding the storm swells like a massive steel island. The workers were waiting on the supply deck, moving with urgent efficiency to receive the medical cargo. The delivery proceeded with surreal normalcy despite the impossible circumstances. We transferred the burn treatment kits and trauma equipment while lightning revealed and concealed the platform in alternating moments. The workers handled the medical supplies with obvious familiarity, immediately disappearing into the structure with equipment that might save lives, if anyone on board was actually alive to be saved. The manifest was signed by Morrison again, but this time his hand shook so violently that the signature was barely legible. As I watched him write, the lightning illuminated his face clearly for the first time. His skin was waxy and pale, marked with dark stains that looked like old burn scars. His eyes were clouded and unfocused, and when he looked up at me, I could see through him to the platform structure behind. After we cast off and began the dangerous voyage back to port, I examined the signed manifest under the cabin light. The signature wasn't written in ink or pen. It was smeared in something dark, rust-colored, and still wet, despite the hours that had passed since signing. When I returned to the port and submitted my delivery report, dispatch had no record of the emergency requisition. Janet insisted that no medical supplies had been scheduled for delivery, and the manifest I carried showed blank pages. No writing, no stamps, no signatures. But the cargo was gone. 2 pallets of burn treatment kits and trauma equipment had vanished from my hold, delivered to coordinates that officially contained nothing but empty ocean. I left supply boat operations after that incident. The pay was good, the work was steady, but I couldn't continue delivering cargo to platforms that existed in the spaces between lightning flashes, signed for by men who had died decades before I was born. But the manifests didn't end with my departure from the industry. Through contacts still working Gulf supply runs, I continue hearing stories from other captains who encounter similar phenomena. Deliveries signed by long-dead platform managers, cargo dropped at coordinates no map shows as containing structures, requisition for equipment that hasn't been manufactured since the disasters claimed the original platforms, emergency medical supplies delivered to installations where the only injuries occurred decades ago. One captain told me about a delivery of vintage Christmas decorations, specific brands from the 1970s, to coordinates where a platform had been lost during the holiday season of '78. The workers who received the cargo were preparing for a Christmas celebration that had been interrupted by disaster 30 years earlier. Another good captain described delivering repair parts for equipment that was destroyed in the platforms and in the fires in their explosions that claimed them. Obsolete components for machinery that no longer exists, requested by engineering staff who died trying to prevent the disasters that destroyed their installations. This pattern suggests that these phantom platforms, as I've come to call them, continue operating in some form, maintaining the routines and requirements that they had when disaster struck. They still need supplies, still file requisitions, still sign manifests according to proper maritime protocol. The only difference is that their needs are frozen in time, requesting equipment that was current when they were lost, signed for by personnel who died in their destruction. Maybe the ocean has its own fleet of installations, platforms lost to every kind of danger that exists out there. Maybe these disasters were so sudden and catastrophic that they caught the crew completely unprepared, and now they can't tell the difference between being dead or alive. The Gulf has claimed dozens of offshore platforms over the decades, each loss representing not just destroyed equipment, but lost lives and interrupted routines. Workers who died at their posts completing tasks that were never finished, following procedures that were never completed. Perhaps death at sea doesn't end the workday for some crews. Perhaps platforms destroyed in their prime continue requiring the supplies and equipment they needed to complete operations that were terminated by a disaster. And perhaps the maritime supply industry, with its emphasis on reliable delivery regardless of conditions, continues serving customers who exist in the spaces between what was and what is. I still maintain my captain's license and occasionally fill in for other supply boat operators during vacation periods, but I'm careful about which manifests I accept, and I always check coordinates against historical disaster records before setting course for unfamiliar platforms. Because some installations never stop running, not even after they're gone. They continue filing requisitions, continue requesting supplies, continue signing manifests with signatures written in something darker than ink. And somewhere in that gulf, supply boats are still making deliveries to platforms that exist only in the moments between lightning flashes serving crews who have been waiting decades for cargo that will help them complete the work that they were never able to finish. If you're enjoying this video, please be sure to like and subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you get all of our latest videos. And if you have stories that you want to share with us, please send them to me, Ulrich Mossberg, at thedreadjournal@gmail.com. I'm glad that somebody is finally taking this story seriously and that they're willing to hear me out. Even if it's just this YouTube channel, then I'll take it. At this point, I just need somebody to know about this. My name is David, and I've been a drilling systems technician for 11 years, specializing in pressure monitoring and well control systems. I've worked on platforms from the North Sea to the South China Sea, but nothing in my technical training prepared me for what I encountered on Deepwater Meridian during the autumn of 2020. On an oil rig, nothing is monitored more closely than well pressure. Too high, and you risk a catastrophic blowout that can destroy the entire platform and kill everyone aboard. Too low, and the wellbore collapses, potentially trapping drill strings worth millions of dollars and creating environmental hazards that take years to remediate. Pressure readings are precise, measured in pounds per square inch down to the decimal points, monitored continuously by multiple redundant systems, and treated with the kind of respect usually reserved for nuclear reactor controls. So what happens when the instruments show numbers that violate the laws of physics? Readings that no geological reservoir could ever produce, from wells that official drilling records show were never penetrated. This is the story that I have to share. It's from the impossible pressure readings that drove me away from offshore work forever. Deepwater Meridian was a state-of-the-art drilling platform positioned 180 miles southeast of Galveston, operating in 6,000 feet of water above what geological surveys indicated was one of the richest oil deposits ever discovered in the Gulf of Mexico. The platform housed 154 workers and represented the cutting edge of deepwater drilling technology, with computer-controlled systems that could monitor and adjust drilling parameters in real time. Because I was working on this rig during the pandemic, I had to make sure that everything was perfectly fine on my health, and if that was not properly maintained and I came back as positive for COVID-19, then I would not be allowed to return on the rig until the disease passed. Honestly, I wish I got sick. If I did, then maybe I wouldn't be haunted by this, but I have to keep going. My station was in the central monitoring room, surrounded by banks of digital displays that showed pressure readings from every active well, mud weight calculations, gas detection levels, and dozens of other critical parameters. The room operated 24 hours a day, with technicians like me maintaining constant vigilance over the numbers that kept the platform safe and productive. Pressure monitoring was both art and science. Normal reservoir pressure in our drilling area ranged from 4,000 to 8,500 psi, depending on depth and geological formation. Anything above 10,000 psi triggered automatic shutdown procedures. Anything below 2,000 psi indicated potential wellbore instability. The margins for error were narrow, and the consequences of missing anomalies were potentially fatal. My supervisor was Ellen, a petroleum manager from Texas who'd been monitoring drilling operations for 15 years. Ellen ran the pressure monitoring division with military precision, requiring double verification of any unusual readings and immediate notification of platform management for any pressure variation outside normal parameters. Pressure keeps the oil under control, she told me during my first week of orientation. Lose track of it, and you lose everything. The well, platform, and probably your life. The monitoring systems were designed with multiple redundancies. Primary sensors measured pressure at the wellhead. Secondary sensors monitored conditions in the drill string, and tertiary backup systems provided independent verification. All readings were logged digitally, compared against predictive models, and analyzed by software that could detect trends and anomalies faster than human operators. It was during a routine night shift in October that I first encountered the readings that would haunt my nightmares for dreams afterwards. I was conducting the standard midnight systems check, scanning through pressure readings from all active wells, when I noticed something that made me freeze at my workstation. Well A7, our primary production well, was showing pressure readings of 47,000 psi, a number so impossibly high it should have destroyed every component in the drill string instantly. At that pressure level, the steel pipe would have ruptured like a balloon. The blowout preventer would have been overwhelmed and destroyed. The entire wellhead assembly would have been blown apart with explosive force that would have been audible throughout the platform. Yet, my communications with the drill floor indicated normal operations, with the crew reporting no unusual vibrations, sounds, or equipment malfunctions. I immediately began recalibration procedures, assuming sensor malfunction or data transmission errors, but repeated calibrations showed identical readings. The pressure sensors were functioning normally, receiving clean signals, and displaying consistent data. According to every instrument at my disposal, well A7 was experiencing pressure levels that defied everything I understood about geology and engineering. When I called Ellen at home to report the anomaly, her response was immediate. Shut it down, now. Emergency protocols. But when I activated the emergency shutdown sequence, the surface equipment showed normal pressure drops as the well was isolated and secured. The drill crew reported standard shutdown procedures with no complications, yet the monitors continued displaying 47,000 psi, as if the shutdown had never occurred. But over the next hour, impossible readings began spreading. Well B3 spiked to 52,000 psi. Well C1 showed 61,000 psi. Then, an entire section of the drilling grid displayed pressure readings that should have turned the oil platform into a crater in the Gulf floor. Each affected well showed numbers beyond the limits of physics. The pressures being displayed would require reservoir conditions that didn't exist anywhere on Earth. Yet the actual drilling operations continued normally, with crews reporting routine activities and equipment functioning exactly as designed. By morning, 12 wells were displaying impossible pressure readings while operating perfectly normally. Ellen arrived on the platform by helicopter, bringing a team of specialists from the drilling contractor's engineering department. They spent 3 days running diagnostics, replacing sensors, and testing every component in the monitoring system. Every test confirmed that the equipment was functioning normally. The sensors were accurate, the data transmission was clean, and the computer systems were operating within specifications. Yet, the impossible pressure readings persisted, showing numbers that violated basic principles of reservoir engineering. Dr. Patterson, a petroleum engineer with 30 years of experience, examined the data with growing bewilderment. These readings would require reservoir pressures equivalent to the Earth's core, he told Ellen during a private meeting I overheard. Geological formations at this location couldn't sustain 1% of those pressure levels. That's when Ellen made a discovery that changed our understanding of the situation entirely. She overlaid the anomalous pressure readings onto a grid map of our drilling coordinates and compared them against our official well survey data. The pressure readings weren't coming from our active wells at all. They were originating from coordinates where no drilling had ever been conducted according to our records. The monitors are reading pressure sources beneath the seabed that don't correspond to any wells we've drilled, Ellen explained to the platform's management team. It's as if these active wells are just not showing up in our drilling logs. Dr. Patterson suggested that we might be detecting natural gas or oil seeps from undrilled geological formations, but the readings were too precise and consistent for natural phenomena. The pressure signatures showed the characteristics of active drilling operations. controlled, monitored, and managed according to standard industry practices. I volunteered to research historical drilling records for our operational area, hoping to find some explanation for the mysterious pressure sources. What I discovered in the archives kept me awake for 3 days straight. Every coordinate showing these phantom pressure readings corresponded exactly to the location of a catastrophic drilling incident from previous operations. Wells where blowouts had killed entire crews, platforms destroyed by uncontrolled pressure releases, drilling disasters that had become cautionary tales throughout the industry. Phantom reading at the coordinates matched the site where another drill platform had been destroyed by a massive blowout in 1987. The pressure signature at another corresponded to where another rig had experienced a catastrophic pressure release back in '94, resulting in the loss of the entire platform and 31 lives. Each phantom well matched a historical disaster where uncontrolled pressure had claimed lives and destroyed equipment. Wells that had been sealed with concrete plugs after the incident, abandoned as too dangerous for continued operations, forgotten by everyone except the families of the men who had died drilling with them. But according to our sensors, they were active again. Pressure building, monitored, controlled by someone or something that understood drilling operations well enough to manage reservoir conditions according to industry standards. The pattern became even more disturbing when I analyzed the timing of the pressure readings. Each phantom well showed activity during specific hours, typically between midnight and 6 a.m., with pressure patterns that suggested active drilling operations conducted by experienced crews following standard procedures. One night in November, I was monitoring the phantom readings when something unprecedented occurred. Pressure reading from one of the disaster sites began climbing steadily, following the exact pattern that historical records showed had preceded the fatal blowout 33 years earlier. I watched in horror as the numbers climbed higher and higher. 20,000 psi, 30,000 psi, 40,000 psi, far beyond the red line levels that should have triggered emergency shutdowns. The pattern was identical to the pressure buildup that had killed 23 men when their blowout preventer failed and uncontrolled pressure turned their platform into an inferno. At exactly 3:17 a.m., matching the precise time recorded in the accident reports, the pressure reading flatlined, not dropping to zero like a normal system shutdown, not gradually declining like a controlled pressure release, simply gone, as if the well had ceased to exist in that instant. The monitoring room fell silent except for the hum of computers and ventilation systems. I sat staring at the blank pressure display, trying to process what I had just witnessed. Then, minutes later, a voice came through the general communications system. Pressure stable, situation contained. The voice was calm, professional, using standard drilling terminology to support successful pressure control operations, but I recognized the speaker from safety recordings I'd reviewed during my research. It was the drilling supervisor who had died trying to control the blowout back in 1987. The phantom pressure readings became a regular occurrence, always during night shifts when the platform's routine activities were at their lowest levels. Each phantom well would show building pressure following historical patterns that matched the disasters that had occurred at those coordinates. The readings would climb to impossible levels, then suddenly disappear at the exact times when the original accidents had claimed lives. Sometimes the pressure normalization was accompanied by radio communications from the phantom wells, always calm, professional voices, reporting successful pressure management using terminology and procedures that had been standard during the decades when the original disasters occurred. Voices belonging to drilling supervisors, mud engineers, and pressure control specialists who had died trying to prevent the very blowouts that destroyed their platforms. Platform management's response was predictable corporate denial. equipment anomalies, data artifacts from electromagnetic interference, stress-related misinterpretations of normal system variations. Ellen was quietly transferred to another platform, officially for career development opportunities, but actually for asking too many questions about phenomena that couldn't be explained through conventional engineering. But the phantom readings continued, and other technicians began reporting similar experiences during night shifts. Pressure buildups from wells that didn't exist, managed by crews that had died decades earlier, following patterns that replicated the final hours of platforms lost to drilling disasters. The final incident that convinced me to leave offshore work occurred during a severe storm in December. High winds and heavy seas had forced the platform into emergency mode, with all non-essential personnel evacuated and drilling operations suspended until conditions improved. I was alone in the monitoring room during the storm, maintaining watch over our secured wells and emergency systems when every phantom pressure reading activated simultaneously. All 12 phantom wells showed climbing pressure, building according to the historical patterns that had preceded the respective disasters. The monitoring displays came alive with numbers that defied physics, pressure readings that should have destroyed every piece of equipment on the platform. Warning alarms screamed, emergency lights flashed, and automated systems began attempting to implement shutdown procedures for wells that didn't officially exist. Then, at the peak of the storm, all the screens went black. Complete system failure. Total loss of monitoring capability. For several minutes, I sat in darkness, listening to the wind and rain, while backup power systems struggled to restart the computers. When the monitors finally rebooted, words appeared across every display simultaneously, typed in the standard font used for system messages. Pressure released. I braced for the explosion, the structural failure, the catastrophic destruction that should have followed the release of impossible pressures. But nothing happened. The platform rode out the storm normally, with no equipment change or casualties. Hours later, the Coast Guard reported unusual ocean conditions in our area. Massive underwater currents moving against normal patterns, deep water temperature anomalies, and seismic readings that suggested significant geological activity on the ocean floor. Waves were moving against the prevailing winds, creating dangerous cross currents that posed navigation hazards for vessels throughout the region. When our monitoring systems were fully restored, all phantom pressure readings disappeared. The 12 phantom wells showed no activity, no pressure signatures, no indication they had ever existed. Our displays showed only the legitimate wells we had actually drilled, all operating within normal parameters. But when I plotted the locations of the phantom wells on a navigation chart, they formed a perfect circle within Deepwater Meridian, positioned at the exact center. 12 disaster sites surrounding our platform like the points of a clock, each representing lives lost to uncontrolled pressure during decades of Gulf drilling operations. I submitted my resignation the following week and accepted a position with a land-based drilling company in West Texas. Ellen had already left offshore work, taking a job with an environmental consulting firm that specialized in abandoned well remediation. Dr. Patterson retired early, citing concerns about his health that he never specified, but everyone understood due to his age. The official incident reports attributed the monitoring anomalies to electromagnetic interference from storm activity and temporary system malfunctions caused by power fluctuations. Deepwater Meridian continued normal operations, with new technicians hired to replace those who had requested transfers to other platforms. But through the people that I still talk to from my time working in the Gulf, I keep hearing reports of similar phenomena on other drilling platforms. More of these phantom pressure readings from wells that don't exist, controlled by crews that died, venting the disasters that claimed their lives. Monitoring systems that detect activity from coordinates where platforms were destroyed by the very pressure buildups that are now being managed by the ghosts of their victims. The pattern suggests that Drilling disasters leave more than environmental scars on the ocean floor. They create some form of persistence, a continuation of operations by crews who died at their posts, trying to control pressures that ultimately overwhelmed their equipment and training. Maybe pressure doesn't just measure current geological conditions. Maybe it measures the accumulated weight of every drilling operation that ever penetrated those coordinates, or every drilling disaster that occurred when pressure exceeded the limits of human control, every life lost to the unforgiving mathematics of reservoir engineering. I still work in pressure monitoring, but only onshore where the wells are shallow and the pressures are manageable. Sometimes when I'm calibrating instruments or reviewing pressure data, I think about those impossible readings and wonder what they represent. Were they attempts by the drilling crews that passed to complete their procedures, but they never finished? I can't even bring myself to fathom what that could be. The Gulf continues producing oil and gas from thousands of active wells, supported by platforms that represent the cutting edge of drilling technology. But beneath those modern operations, phantom wells may still be active, managed by crews who died, learning that some pressures can't be controlled, only endured. Deep beneath the Gulf waters, pressure continues building in wells that were sealed decades ago, monitored by men who died trying to prevent the disasters that claimed their platforms. And sometimes, on storm-swept nights, when monitoring systems push the limits of their capabilities, those phantom operations briefly resurface on displays throughout the region. For those who are in my line of work, if you ever find yourself in the Gulf, remember this, for your own sake. Some wells never stop producing. Some crews never stop trying to control pressures, because that's what destroyed their platforms and took their lives. My name is Tommy, and I worked as a communications operator on offshore drilling platforms in the Gulf of Mexico for 9 years. During that time, I maintained radio contact for crews ranging from 80 to 200 workers, coordinated emergency communications during hurricanes and equipment failures, and logged thousands of hours of routine chatter that keeps offshore operations running safely. But nothing, in my experience, ever prepared me for what happened aboard the semi-submersible platform Gulf Horizon during the winter of 2018. On offshore rigs, radios are the absolute heartbeat of survival. Every floor, every worker, every shift operates through constant communication networks that connect drill crews to supervisors, engine room personnel to deckhands, and the entire platform to supply boats, helicopters, and onshore coordination centers. Lose contact for even a few minutes, and you lose situational awareness that can mean the difference between life and death in an emergency. But what happens when entire sections of a rig fall into complete radio silence? When communication systems go dark for hours at a time, only to return with digital logs showing conversations between operators who weren't even on the platform. It sounds crazy, I know. It almost sounds like a fantasy. But if I don't say this now, then I will never find peace. And so I have to tell you about the communication black holes that drove me away from offshore work and still haunt my dreams. Gulf Horizon was a massive semi-submersible drilling platform positioned 160 miles south of Mobile, Alabama, operating in 4,800 feet of water above a promising natural gas formation. The platform housed 147 workers and represented the latest in offshore drilling technology, with redundant communication systems designed to maintain contact even during the worst Gulf storms. My station was in the central communications room, a windowless space filled with banks of radios, satellite equipment, and digital recording systems that captured every transmission for safety and regulatory compliance. The room operated around the clock, with operators like me monitoring 16 different radio channels simultaneously while maintaining logs of all communication traffic. The communication system was designed with multiple backup layers. Primary VHF radios handled routine traffic between work areas. UHF systems managed emergency communications. Satellite phones provided contact with onshore operations, and digital recording equipment captured everything for later analysis. No single point of failure could completely disrupt communications, or so we believed. My supervisor was Rita, a former Coast Guard communication specialist who ran the radio room with military precision. Rita had coordinated communications during Hurricane Katrina, the Deepwater Horizon disaster, and dozens of smaller emergencies that had tested Gulf platforms over the years. Communications keep this platform alive, she told new operators during their first week of orientation. Every worker's life depends on our ability to coordinate responses, relay information, and maintain contact with the outside world. We are the nervous system of this operation, she said, with a voice that I could only describe as both authoritative and yet absolutely gorgeous. The communication protocols were strictly enforced. Every work area checked in hourly during routine operations. Emergency channels remained continuously monitored, and all traffic was logged with timestamps and operator identification codes. Missing a scheduled check-in triggered immediate investigation, and communication equipment failures activated automatic backup systems within seconds. It was during a routine night shift in November that I first encountered the phenomenon that would change my understanding of how communication systems could function, and also my understanding of the nature of reality itself. I was monitoring normal evening traffic, shift handovers between day and night crews, routine equipment status reports, casual conversation between workers in different areas of the platform. Communication was typical for a Thursday night, steady, predictable, professionally managed. That's when things started going downhill. At exactly 11:47 p.m., radio contact with the North Wing living quarters went completely silent. Not static, not interference, not equipment failure sounds. Absolute silence. The cliche says that silence is deafening, but this was the first time I felt I truly understood that. The channel that had been carrying routine chatter between workers in the residential area simply went dead, as if someone had switched off every radio in that section of the platform at the same time. I immediately implemented communication failure protocols, attempting contact on backup channels, testing equipment connections, and notifying Rita of the communication loss. Standard procedure required immediate investigation of any communication blackout that lasted longer than 5 minutes. These were the first warning signs of fire, gas, leaks, or other emergencies that prevented workers from responding to radio calls. 10 minutes later, contact with the North Wing resumed as suddenly as it had disappeared. Workers in that area responded normally to radio checks, reporting routine activities, and expressing confusion when I asked if they had experienced any communication problems. "We've been talking the whole time," insisted Jake, the night shift supervisor for the North Wing residential area. "Radio's been working fine, just the usual chatter between the guys." But when I reviewed the digital recording system, the evidence contradicted every report from the workers. The recorders showed that during the 10-minute communication blackout, radio traffic from the North Wing had continued uninterrupted. 30 minutes of clear conversations between two operators who didn't exist on our crew roster. One voice identified themselves as Hall, using radio call sign NH7 that wasn't assigned to any current worker. The other called himself Denton, with call sign NH12 that hadn't been used since our radio system was upgraded 2 years earlier. Both voices were calm, professional, and completely familiar with our platform's operations and procedures. Their recorded conversation covered routine topics: valve pressure checks in the North Wing mechanical rooms, safety drill schedules for the following week, complaints about the quality of coffee in the galley, and speculation about weather conditions for the upcoming shift change. Exactly the kind of professional chatter that occurred between experienced offshore workers during night shifts. But there were no men named Hall or Denton on our crew. According to personnel records, no workers with those names had ever been assigned to Gulf Horizon. The radio call signs they were using hadn't been active for years, and the specific work assignments they discussed didn't match any current operations. When I reported the recording anomaly to Rita, she initially assumed we were picking up radio traffic from another vessel or platform. Cross interference occasionally occurred when atmospheric conditions caused radio signals to travel further than normal, allowing operators to overhear conversations from distant installations. But Rita's investigation revealed that no other platforms were operating close enough to create interference. No supply boats were in our area during the blackout period, and no aircraft had been transiting in our airspace. The phantom conversations were originating from our own communication system, recorded by equipment that showed no signs of malfunction or external interference. Over the next few weeks, the communication blackouts became a regular occurrence, first only affecting the North Wing, then spreading to other areas of the platform in an apparently random pattern. The drill floor would go silent for 20 minutes, followed by resumption of normal communications and digital logs showing conversations that shouldn't have existed. Engine room communications would disappear for an hour, then return with recordings of detailed technical discussions between the two men, Hall and Denton, that I came to call the Phantom Operators. Each blackout followed the same impossible pattern: absolute silence on active radio channels while workers in the affected areas insisted they had maintained normal communications throughout the period. Meanwhile, our digital recording systems captured extensive conversations between non-existent operators, demonstrated intimate knowledge of our platform's operations, procedures, and personnel. The Phantom operators discussed equipment failures that hadn't occurred, maintenance schedules that weren't planned, and safety drills that weren't scheduled. Their conversations included specific details about platform operations that only experienced offshore workers would know, using correct terminology and following proper radio protocols. One recorded conversation was the worst. During a blackout affecting the drill floor, the Phantom operators discussed a major equipment failure. Drill floor compromised. Primary BOP actuator showing hydraulic pressure loss. Initiating emergency shutdown sequence. All personnel clear the drill floor immediately. The recorded emergency continued for 47 minutes, with Phantom voices coordinating evacuation procedures, reporting equipment status, and managing crisis response according to standard platform protocols. Emergency alarms were clearly audible in the recordings, along with the sounds of workers responding to evacuation orders and equipment shutting down automatically. But during the supposed emergency, the actual drill floor was operating normally. Clear skies, routine drilling operations, no equipment failures or safety concerns. Workers reported a quiet, uneventful shift with no unusual incidents. When I researched the specific emergency procedures described in the Phantom recording, they matched exactly, down to individual radio call codes and response timing, with an actual drilling emergency that had occurred on a different platform back in '93. Oil platform Gulf Titan had experienced a blowout preventer failure that killed 8 workers and destroyed the platform. The Phantom operators were apparently recreating that disaster in precise detail, almost 25 years after the original tragedy. This pattern appeared throughout the Phantom recordings. Conversations about storms that had struck different platforms, equipment failures that had occurred on other rigs, emergencies that had claimed lives throughout the Gulf's drilling history. Each Phantom discussion recreated actual events with perfect accuracy, as if the communication system was somehow accessing historical records of disasters that had occurred elsewhere. Blackout periods grew longer, sometimes lasting hours, while entire sections of the platform fell into communication silence. Workers began reporting increasing anxiety about the communication failures, especially during night shifts when the blackouts were most frequent and extensive. Several crew members claimed that they could hear Phantom conversations leading through powered-off radios in their living quarters, faint echoes discussing work assignments, safety procedures, and routine operations that seemed to originate from the radio speakers, even when the equipment was switched off and disconnected from power sources. The worst incident involved Carlos, who was a young electrician from Louisiana. He had joined our crew only 3 months earlier. Carlos was working alone in the North Wing electrical room during a communication blackout when he heard his own voice coming through the radio system. He ran to the communications room in a state of panic, insisting that he had heard himself coordinating emergency electrical repairs during a platform fire. When I reviewed the recordings, Carlos wasn't exaggerating. His voice was clearly audible, calmly reporting electrical systems and their status during what appeared to be a major emergency evacuation. Main power distribution compromised, switching to emergency generators, all non-essential electrical systems offline. Repeat, emergency power only until fire suppression systems can restore normal operations. The recorded emergency lasted for over an hour, with Carlos's voice providing regular updates on electrical system status, coordinating with Phantom supervisors, and following emergency procedures that he had never been trained to perform. But Carlos had been off duty during the entire blackout period, trying to sleep in his quarters on a different deck, with no involvement in any electrical work. What made matters worse was the fact that the emergency procedures described in the recording matched an actual fire that had occurred on the Gulf Pioneer back in 1998, killing 4 electricians, including the man whose job description exactly matched Carlos's current position. The Phantom recording suggested that Carlos was somehow filling the role of the dead electrician, completing the emergency response that had failed 30 years earlier. Platform management's response to the communication anomalies was simple corporate nonsense. They blamed it on the equipment, they blamed it on electromagnetic interference, and they blamed it on stress. They'll do anything to save their own skin and their wallets. It's mind-boggling sometimes. Still, though, the blackouts continued escalating, and the Phantom recordings became increasingly detailed and disturbing. Conversations about disasters that had claimed the lives of hundreds of people throughout the Gulf's drilling history, emergency responses to accidents that had destroyed entire platforms, evacuation procedures for catastrophes that had become legendary within the industry. I reached my breaking point during a severe winter storm in February. Sustained winds over 60 knots and 20-foot seas had forced Gulf Horizon into emergency weathering mode, with all non-essential operations suspended and the crew preparing for potentially dangerous conditions. I was maintaining emergency communications watch in the radio room when lightning struck our satellite communication array, causing a cascading power failure that blacked out half the platform. Emergency generators activated immediately, but the primary communication systems remained offline for almost an hour. The worst part of it all was that the digital recording equipment continued operating on battery backup power, and what it captured during the blackout defied every rational explanation. The recorders filled with phantom communication traffic from dozens of voices, coordinating what just happened to be a massive emergency evacuation. Not just Hall and Denton this time, but entire crews of phantom operators managing a full-scale platform disaster. There were guys shouting evacuation orders, the sirens were wailing, the metallic sounds of equipment failing and structures collapsing, radio traffic that suggested the platform was breaking apart in the storm, with crews abandoning their posts and launching lifeboats in desperate attempts to survive. Through the chaos of the phantom emergency traffic, we heard Captain Morrison's voice, our actual captain, who was standing in the radio room with us, calmly broadcasting a Mayday transmission. Mayday, Mayday, this is Gulf Horizon. Platform compromised by storm damage. Structural integrity failing. All hands abandoning platform. Repeat, all hands lost. Platform breaking up. Captain Morrison stood frozen beside the radio equipment, listening to his own voice declare the deaths of everyone on board the platform. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. His own voice was broadcasting our destruction to the Coast Guard's rescue operations that only existed in the phantom recording. This phantom emergency continued for 3 hours, with detailed communications covering every aspect of platform abandonment, rescue coordination, and casualty reporting. Voices of our actual crew members appeared throughout the recording, calmly reporting their own deaths and coordinating evacuation procedures they had never been trained to perform. When platform power was restored and normal communications resumed, the storm was passing, and Gulf Horizon had weathered the conditions without significant damage. No evacuations, no casualties, no structural problems. The platform had ridden out the storm exactly as designed, with experienced crews maintaining safe operations throughout the emergency. But the digital recordings told a different story. 3 hours of detailed documentation, showing the complete destruction of our platform and the deaths of everyone aboard, broadcast in the voices of the actual victims who were still alive and unharmed. The final entry in the phantom recording was a single voice, unidentified but familiar, whispering through the static, "Shift complete, logging off." I submitted my resignation the following week and took a position with another company out in East Texas. Rita had already gone to another platform. The company said that the reason why was because she was taken there for advanced training opportunities. But I knew the truth. She was asking too many questions about phenomena that corporate management preferred to ignore, and still continue to ignore, I would wager. The official incident reports attributed the communication anomalies to severe weather interference and temporary equipment malfunctions. Gulf Horizon continued normal operations with a new communications staff who were briefed on standard operating procedures, with no mention of phantom operators or impossible recordings. But through contacts still working on the Gulf platforms, I continue hearing reports of similar communication blackouts throughout the region. Entire sections of rigs going silent while digital recorders capture conversations between operators who died in accidents decades earlier, recreating the disasters that claimed their lives and the platforms they were trying to save. I still work in communications, but only onshore, where radio systems connect to land-based towers rather than satellite networks that span the Gulf's disaster-prone waters. Sometimes when I'm monitoring routine traffic or testing emergency procedures, I think about those phantom voices and wonder if they represent the persistence of professional dedication beyond death. The Gulf continues supplying dozens of active drilling platforms, each independent on communication systems that connect isolated crews to the wider world. But some of those systems may also be connecting current operations to those who have died, to those who still regret, and to those who lost their lives just trying to make it through another day. So please, hear me well. I am not a phantom operator. I am not someone who has ever once believed in the supernatural until just now. But I can't ignore the evidence I've seen. These phantom communications continue to persist to this day. Whether you want to call that dedication to work, or even worse, not even realizing that you're dead. I know one thing for sure. I'm never going back to the Gulf again. And for those who are still out there, please, the last thing you want is to become one of the voices on the radio, still unsure whether you're just doing another day on your job, or if your entire afterlife is bound to the place that claimed your life. I've seen a lot of things in my time as a pilot. I've seen people jump for joy when they see their loved ones. I've seen people who would beg me to take them as far away as possible, running away from something or someone else. And as crazy as a lot of the stories I have are, nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what I saw in the Gulf of Mexico. My name is Jake, and I've been flying offshore helicopters for over 14 years. During that time, I've transported thousands of workers, delivered millions of pounds of cargo, and conducted emergency evacuations that saved lives when platforms faced fires, storms, and equipment failures that could kill entire crews in minutes. But nothing in my flight training prepared me for the platforms that exist only when you need them most, and vanish the moment you look away. Offshore oil rigs absolutely rely on helicopters. We bring fresh crews in, fly exhausted workers out, and we serve as a critical link between isolated platforms and the mainland. Every flight is meticulously logged. Every landing detail has to be charted. Every helipad inspection documented for safety and regulatory compliance. In an industry where a single mistake can claim dozens of lives, aviation operations follow protocols that are sometimes more rigid than military standards. But what happens when experienced pilots report routine landings on rigs that just don't exist? Platforms that appear on no navigation charts, no company records, no satellite images, yet somehow accept legitimate cargo deliveries and provide signed manifests that satisfy corporate accounting systems. and honestly, not much else. I, I have to say this. I have to tell this story. I, I don't know if I'll be able to live with myself unless this gets out. So I have to thank whoever's reading this, whoever this got sent to. Truly. At least now I know, even if one other person knows what I know, I won't be alone anymore. So I worked for Gulf Coast Aviation Services, a helicopter charter that was based in Louisiana. We handled crew transport and cargo delivery for dozens of offshore platforms throughout the region. Our fleet had 12 helicopters ranging from small passenger aircraft to heavy lift cargo machines capable of transporting multi-ton equipment to remote drilling sites. My aircraft was a Sikorsky S-76, configured for mixed passenger and cargo operations, with a range of 400 nautical miles and the capability to operate in weather conditions that grounded smaller helicopters. I typically flew two routes: crew changes every 14 days, transporting workers between onshore bases and their assigned platforms, and emergency supply runs when platforms needed critical equipment or medical evacuations. Flight operations were governed by strict FAA regulations and company policies that required detailed documentation of every aspect of our operations. We had our flight plans filed with air traffic control, weather briefings updated hourly, cargo manifests cross-checked against platform requisitions, and post-flight reports documenting any deviation from standard procedures. My supervisor was Captain Linda. She was a former Coast Guard pilot who'd spent 20 years flying search and rescue missions throughout the Gulf. Linda managed aviation operations with the kind of precision that comes from understanding how quickly offshore conditions can turn deadly for aircrew and for platform personnel. Every flight over the Gulf carries life and death responsibility, Linda told the new pilots during their orientation briefings. You're not just transporting passengers or cargo. You're maintaining the lifeline that keeps isolated workers connected to safety, medical care, and their families on shore. She was always good at grilling us. That just goes to show how much she really cared. The helicopter routes were carefully planned to optimize fuel consumption, minimize weather exposure, and maintain communication with air traffic control throughout each flight. Standard operating procedures required pilots to verify platform coordinates before departure, confirm landing clearance with the rig supervisors, and file detailed reports documented cargo deliveries and passenger transfers. It was during a routine supply run in March 2019 that I first encountered the event that would change my understanding of everything. The flight was scheduled as a standard cargo delivery to platform Echo 12, positioned approximately 85 miles southeast of Morgan City. The cargo manifest included routine supplies, replacement parts for drilling equipment, medical supplies for the platform's dispensary, and food service items requested by the galley staff. Weather conditions were optimal: clear skies, light winds, excellent visibility extending beyond the horizon. I filed my flight plan at 0800 hours, completed the pre-flight inspection, loaded cargo according to the weight and balance requirements, and departed Lafayette Regional Airport with an estimated time of 45 minutes to the target coordinates. Navigation was handled by GPS systems, that were cross-referenced with marine charts and compass headings, things that had been standard for decades. Should have been normal. I really hope it was going to be normal too. Flight proceeded normally until I reached the general area specified in the navigation data. GPS indicated I was at the correct coordinates, but my visual scanning revealed only empty ocean extending to the horizon. I must have circled the area for 10 minutes, double-checking navigation instruments and radio frequencies. I assumed I had misread the coordinates or confused the platform identification codes. Then, through the haze that perpetually hung over the Gulf's waters, steel structures began emerging like a mirage, resolving into solid reality. First, the top of the derrick, then the outline of the living quarters, and then finally the rig itself. This is where my navigation systems indicated that platform Echo 12 was located. But something was wrong with the visual appearance. The platform looked older than the modern structure described in my flight briefing. Weathered steel, faded paint, and a design that seemed to be at least 50 years old. The helipad markings were correct. The landing approach was clear, and the workers were visible on the dock in their coveralls and getting ready to receive cargo. I established radio contact with the platform using standard frequency protocols. Echo 12, this is Gulf Coast Aviation 47 requesting landing clearance for cargo delivery. The response came immediately, clear and professional. Gulf Coast 47, you are cleared for landing. Helipad secure. Cargo crew standing by. The landing proceeded normally. I touched down smoothly on the helipad, maintained rotor RPM for quick departure, and supervised cargo offloading by workers who moved with practiced efficiency. The platform crew was professional, but seemed to keep to themselves. They handled the supplies without most casual conversation that I was used to from offshore workers. When the cargo transfer was complete, a figure in overalls appeared with the delivery manifest. The signature was scrawled quickly but legibly. His name was Harrison, the platform manager. He stamped the manifest with an official company seal before going back into the platform and didn't exchange a single pleasantry with me. The return flight to Lafayette was routine, and I filed the standard post-flight report documenting successful cargo delivery to the platform Echo 12. But when I submitted the signed manifest to our dispatch office, the response was immediate and confused. Jake, there's a problem with your delivery report, Linda told me during the post-flight briefing. Platform Echo 12 is currently positioned 80 miles northeast of your reported coordinates. You delivered cargo to coordinates that show empty ocean on all official charts. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried explaining that I showed the manifest that was signed by Harrison and that I had landed on a platform exactly where the GPS indicated where it should have been. Linda pulled up the satellite imagery and marine charts that confirmed her statement. Apparently, I had flown away past where I was supposed to go, but I was there, and there was nothing else I could do except insist that I had done my job as instructed. Well, maybe you landed on the wrong platform, Linda said. It's an easy mistake to make when you're tired or dealing with poor visibility. But I had confirmed the platform identification through radio contact, landed on a helipad with the correct markings, and received a properly signed manifest from a platform manager who identified himself as working for Echo 12. The delivery had proceeded exactly according to standard protocols, yet official records indicated I had somehow delivered cargo to empty ocean. Over the next few months, similar reports began filtering through the Gulf aviation community. Other pilots described routine landings on platforms that weren't listed in their flight plans, cargo deliveries to rigs that didn't appear on navigation charts, and encounters with platform crews who accepted supplies but couldn't be verified through company records. Captain Mike, who flew for Offshore Transport Solutions, described landing on what appeared to be a modern drilling platform that matched his navigation coordinates perfectly. Everything looked normal, Mike told a group of pilots during our monthly safety meeting. Good weather, clear approach, professional crew. They offloaded my cargo efficiently and signed the manifest properly. But when I got back to base, dispatch insisted that there was no platform at these coordinates. Should have caught on by then. But I guess I didn't have enough evidence. Either that or I didn't want to believe it. But it started to compound. Similar stories emerged from pilots throughout the region. Captain Susan reported delivering emergency medical supplies to a platform that had requested an immediate helicopter transport for an injured worker, only to learn that no platform existed and no medical emergency was reported. Captain Bob described multiple encounters with what he called ghost rigs that appeared solid during landing, but couldn't be located when he attempted to return with follow-up deliveries. So, during one of our safety meetings, we began to cross-reference the platforms that we visited with historical maritime records. And what we found out shocked us. Every single platform that we had visited was a platform that had already existed in the past. There was a very shocking detail between them. There was a murder on every single one of them, and they all looked like accidents. The only reason why we were able to ascertain that they were murders was because there was a name that had been consistent throughout all of them. Harrison. The supervisor. The rig manager. He was on every single platform that we delivered these materials to. And he was the one who was convicted of murder on every single one of these platforms. The correlation was impossible to ignore. We kept landing on it, accepting cargo deliveries for Harrison. And now we had no idea what to do. We know that Harrison was arrested and eventually faced a death row for his crimes, executed sometime back in '95, but where are we seeing him now? We had to put something to the test. So we convinced company management to authorize an experimental flight with enhanced documentation equipment. Captain Torres volunteered to equip one of our helicopters with multiple cameras, GPS tracking devices, and digital recording equipment that would capture every aspect of a delivery to one of these platforms where we would find Harrison. The test flight was scheduled as a routine cargo delivery, but the pilot that carried the equipment would also document the encounter in every detail. They would have body cameras, cockpit recording systems, and external cameras that could capture the platform structure from multiple angles during approach and during landing. The recorded footage was both compelling and impossible to explain rationally. The video showed the pilot flying over empty ocean according to navigation instruments, then approaching what appeared to be a fully operational offshore drilling platform that materialized through atmospheric haze as he drew near. The helipad looked solid and properly maintained. The landing approach was smooth and professional. Workers in coveralls approached the helicopter and began offloading cargo with practiced efficiency, though their faces always seemed to remain obscured behind smeared safety visors that reflected sunlight and made identifying them impossible. The platform manager, who signed the cargo manifest, appeared normal in the recorded footage, though the camera had somehow failed to capture clear images of his face or identification badges. The signature was completed with the standard procedures, stamped with what appeared to be legitimate company seals, and documented according to established protocols. The worst part of it, though, was when Harrison stared directly at one of the cameras. He was different somehow. His eyes were glazed over. His face was more unkempt than I'd ever seen anyone else. And I don't know if the pilot remembers, or maybe he knows too well. He didn't speak. Harrison just did not speak. So this left us with a subsequent investigation of each cargo delivery that Harrison wanted. We checked every company record. We checked everything in the inventories. We checked everything that was offloaded. But all we could find was our supplies were missing. Every time we went there, it was like Harrison was stealing our supplies. But he wasn't doing it in a way that seemed obvious to management. Obviously, corporate wasn't doing anything about it. They just wanted to keep it all under wraps. The last thing they wanted was for their company to be associated with a man like Harrison again. The most serious incident with this occurred during a severe storm in November, when Captain Rodriguez radioed that he was running low on fuel and needed to make an emergency landing. Dispatch guided him towards the nearest platform according to official charts, but weather conditions and low visibility made navigation extremely challenging. Captain Rodriguez never reached the designated platform. Instead, his helicopter disappeared from radar contact for over 3 hours, while search and rescue operations combed the area where his last transmission was received. The Coast Guard scrambled. They knew for a fact that Captain Rodriguez was an important asset to the company that we worked for, and the last thing they wanted was to not find him. I kept thinking, was this Harrison's doing? It might have been. Who knows what that ghost was doing? Here I am calling him a ghost. What's wrong with me? Do I really believe in the paranormal? Guess I don't have a choice but to at this point. And that's what made what happened next even more confusing. Rodriguez's aircraft reappeared on radar as he was approaching Lafayette International Airport. He landed safely, but he was clearly shaken by whatever he had experienced during the missing hours. He was gone for about 3, and his flight recorder showed data that he had indicated at a platform 60 miles off his intended course, coordinates that matched the location where Gulf Titan had collapsed during Hurricane Carmen back in '74. When we questioned Rodriguez about what happened, he initially refused to provide details beyond the basic flight report required by FAA regulations. But during a private conversation weeks later, he told me what really happened. I was running on fumes when I saw lights through the storm. he told me quietly. Platform appeared solid. Helipad clearly marked. Crew waving me in for landing. Everything looked normal except for the weather. They were operating in storm conditions that should have forced evacuation hours earlier. The phantom platform that he landed on provided fuel, allowing him to get his helicopter and return safely to shore. But the fuel delivery records showed signatures from ground crew members who were victims of Harrison back when the original platform collapsed 50 years earlier after his death. The aviation fuel had somehow been legitimate. Chemical analysis confirmed it met all specifications, yet it had been provided by personnel who couldn't possibly exist. They acted like they were waiting for me, Rodriguez explained, smiling, waving, moving with purpose like they had important work to complete. Professional, competent, but something was wrong with their timing, like they were still operating on schedules from decades ago. And I also didn't see their supervisor. Harrison was nowhere to be found, and that was the first time I had ever seen such a jovial oil platform crew. It was mind-boggling and honestly unnerving. After Rodriguez's experience, company management quietly began discouraging pilots from discussing these phantom platform encounters, and the name of Harrison especially was taboo. Official policy declared such reports as navigation errors caused by stress and adverse weather conditions. There was a whole bunch of other corporate jargon that they were using to try and hide these things, but that's all they were doing. They were just trying to hide everything, just like they tried to hide Harrison and his case. I then looked around and I talked to someone else, someone who had worked with Harrison in the past. He asked me not to share his name, and so I won't. But he does remember being the one who finally caught Harrison after surviving an attempt with him. It's strange. I had met Harrison in person. He seemed standoffish and professional, but aside from that, he was more or less what I would expect a supervisor to be on an oil rig. And here I was talking with somebody who knew him from 50 years ago. And all I could do was think to myself, why? Why were we seeing him? Why did he commit murder? Naturally, I told him about the platforms. I told him about Captain Rodriguez's story. And all he said to me in response was, there are some people who will never be satisfied, not even with their deaths. It's best to leave. I took his advice, and so I left. I left Gulf Coast Aviation Services 2 weeks after that, after I put in my notice. And then I became a pilot with a commercial airline that operated exclusively over land. The pay was lower and the work was less challenging, but I couldn't continue flying missions where navigation instruments might guide me to platforms that existed, spaces between reality and maritime memory. Especially not with the spirit of a murderer potentially lurking on one of them. The rest of us were all quietly transferred. Captain Rodriguez stopped flying offshore entirely, and everyone else who had seen or heard about these oil platforms that disappeared and that were run by a convicted murderer were either silenced by being bought off, or they were just simply phased out of the company with their testimonies disregarded. But what really gets to me is Captain Rodriguez's story. The smiles of the workers. Why were they so happy? Why did they look as though everything was fine? Why were they so helpful when they had been so reserved before? I don't like speculating, but the only thing I can think of is that the oil rigs, the Phantom ones at least, they're not places where Harrison has any real power. I think they're his prison. And the ghosts of those who died are the ones that are keeping him imprisoned. It's not something I like to think about, but I couldn't do that. I couldn't continue to work out in such horrifying conditions anymore. I'd have enough nightmares, especially after seeing Harrison's face, and they'll haunt me for the rest of my days. These cargo deliveries that we made, we never got the equipment back. We never got the supplies back. But what matters is that I escaped with my life. I just hope that every single other pilot out in the Gulf comes across these platforms is as lucky as I was. I've gone by a lot of names in my time, so I guess right now I'll go with Bobby. And I worked as a crew supervisor on an offshore drilling platform in the Gulf of Mexico for 16 years. During that time, I managed shift rotations for hundreds of workers, maintained precise timekeeping records that satisfied both union contracts and federal safety regulations, and coordinated the 12-hour shift changes that kept drilling operations running 24 hours a day. But nothing in my supervisory experience prepared me for what happened aboard Platform Gulf Star during the summer of 2022, when phantom workers began appearing on shifts. Workers who didn't just clock in and disappear, but actively interfered with operations in ways that nearly took my life and the lives of so many others. On an offshore platform, shift changes are the heartbeat of survival. Crews work 12 hours on, 12 hours off, in a rhythm that maintains continuous operations while preventing the fatigue that can kill workers in seconds when they're operating heavy machinery above thousands of feet of dark water. Every punch card is logged in triplicate, every worker accounted for through multiple redundant systems. Every shift transition documented with precision that would impress military quartermasters. But what happens when phantom workers begin sabotaging your operations? When they're not just ghostly echoes of the past, but active, malevolent presences trying to claim living workers for their eternal shifts. This story, it's painful for me to even write down. I can feel my arms shaking as I'm typing this before I send it over to the Dread Journal. But if I don't get this out, then it will stay with me forever. Someone has to know. Someone has to know what I survived. Even if they don't believe me, at least someone will know. Platform Gulf Star was a massive jack-up drilling rig positioned 127 miles southeast of New Orleans, operating in 340 feet of water above a natural gas formation that geological surveys had identified as potentially one of the richest deposits in Gulf history. The platform housed 142 workers during peak operations, with crews rotating through precisely timed 12-hour shifts that maintained drilling activities around the clock. The timekeeping system was state-of-the-art technology that required workers to scan ID cards through magnetic readers connected to a central computer database. Each scan was time-stamped, logged automatically, and cross-referenced against work schedules to verify that employees were clocking in and out at authorized times. I had been working at the Gulf Star rig for 8 months, and those 8 months were peaceful. I still kind of look back on them and feel good, knowing that I was getting work done, that everyone was doing what they needed to do. Then everything changed. The first sign of trouble came during a routine evening shift change in June. As the day crew clocked out, I noticed extra time punches in the digital logs. Names of workers who'd already left the company months or even days ago. Eric LeBlanc, who had transferred after a crane accident. There was also Tommy Williams, who'd quit after a safety violation. And then there was Marcus. I don't remember his last name, but I know he died in a blowout on another platform. Initially, I attributed the discrepancies to glitch systems, but then the phantom workers began appearing visually during shift changes. They appeared as men in faded coveralls and tarnished hard hats, moving through our work areas like they belonged there. At first, they seemed harmless. They'd clock in, walk to work areas, and by morning they'd be gone, having clocked out according to the digital records. But no one could remember seeing them work, and no tasks had been completed in the areas where they were assigned. That changed during the third week of July. I was conducting a routine inspection when I found Jack Wen, one of our drill operators, unconscious on the drill floor. He was pale, breathing shallow, his body temperature dangerously low despite the 90-degree heat. When the medic took care of him, he was disoriented, and he kept mumbling about the others, trying to get him to join the permanent shift. "I said I belonged with him," he whispered, his eyes unfocused. "Said the living shifts were temporary, but theirs lasted forever. They tried to pull me down into the water. Said I'd be happier working where it's always quiet." The medic diagnosed him with severe hypothermia and exhaustion, but he had been working in blazing heat, and his shift had just started an hour earlier. There was no medical explanation for his condition. That night, I decided to observe the platform shift change directly. I positioned myself at the timekeeping station at 5:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the official transition. As day shift workers began gathering to clock out, I watched the digital displays carefully. At exactly 5:59 p.m., the scanner beeped. No one was standing at the machine, but the display showed J. Hebert, driller, shift 2, clock in, successful. Jerome Hebert had worked Gulf Star the previous year before transferring to another platform, but according to company records, he died in a gas leak 6 months before that time. Then, the air around the timekeeping station grew cold, not the artificial cold of air conditioning, but the bone-deep chill of a morgue. My breath began fogging despite the station's heating system running normally. Gradually, they began to show up. Not suddenly, but slowly. They were like invisible images that slowly made their way more visible, and they were coming out of the darkness. They were men in work clothes, their skin pale and their eyes sunken, moving with the mechanical precision of workers, following routines they'd performed thousands of times. But these weren't passive ghosts going through remembered motions. As they passed real workers heading to their posts, phantoms would reach out and touch them. Every worker they touched would stumble, their eyes glazing over, their movements becoming sluggish and mechanical. I watched in horror as Jerry, a welder from our day crew, was touched on the shoulder by one of these phantom workers. Jerry immediately stopped walking toward the exit and instead turned toward the drill floor. His expression was blank. His normal cheerful demeanor replaced by the same hollow stare that the phantoms had. "Jerry!" I called out, but he didn't respond. He walked in perfect synchronization with the phantom who had touched him. Both of them were headed towards the most dangerous section of the platform. This was where the gas lines were pressurized and ran beneath the drill floor. I ran after them, grabbing Jerry by the arm. His skin was ice cold, and when he turned to look at me, his eyes were completely white. No iris, no pupil, just the milky color of the sclera of his eyes. "The shift never ends," he said in a voice that wasn't his own. "We work forever. It's peaceful there. No pain, no exhaustion, just work." I slapped him hard across the face, and Jerry blinked, his normal eye color returning. He looked around in confusion, and he started to shiver violently. "Bobby? What am I doing here? I was heading to the helicopter pad to go home." The phantom worker who had been leading Jerry turned to look at me directly. His face was partially destroyed, like he had been in an explosion or a fire. And I heard him speak, but I could hear multiple voices layering over each other. I realized then they were the voices of all the workers who had died in Gulf accidents over the years. "You cannot keep them from us forever," the phantom said. "Every shift we grow stronger. Every worker who dies joins us. Soon there will be more of us than you, and then the living shifts will end permanently." The temperature around us dropped another 20 degrees. Ice began forming on the metal railings, and I could see our breath in the air. Other phantom workers were spreading throughout the platform, each one targeting living crew members, touching them, trying to convert them into the same blank-eyed zombies that I knew would eventually become ghosts. I was tired of being afraid, so I grabbed the emergency radio and started shouting, "All hands! Emergency protocols! Do not let anyone you don't recognize touch you! Get to the galley immediately!" Some workers responded to my warning, but others had already been touched by the phantoms. I watched as nearly a dozen of our crew members began moving with that same mechanical precision, walking toward the platform's most dangerous areas: the pressurized drilling equipment, the electrical systems, the areas where a single mistake could kill everyone on board. The phantoms weren't just trying to recruit individual workers. They were trying to use the converted living crew to sabotage the platform, to create an accident that would kill everyone aboard and force us all to join their eternal shifts. I realized what was happening. The phantoms couldn't just take the living. They needed the living to choose them, or to die while on duty, to become a part of their crew. They were orchestrating a mass casualty event that would trap all 142 workers
and their phantom rotation shift forever. But I fought the panic in my heart. I ran through the platform, trying to snap converted workers out of their trance before they could damage critical systems. Some responded to physical contact, slapping, shaking, shouting their names. Others were too far gone, moving with robotic determination toward tasks that would doom us all. I found Mike trying to override the automatic gas detection systems that would shut down drilling operations if dangerous concentrations were detected. His phantom controller stood beside him, guiding his hands as Mike systematically disabled every safety protocol we had. I ran up to Mike and tackled him, but the phantom grabbed me by the throat. Its grip was like being clutched by a winter storm, not just cold, but actively draining warmth from my body. I could feel everything, my energy, my life force, even my consciousness being pulled away. Everything was turning darker, and my brain and my thoughts started becoming sluggish.
"Join us willingly,"
The phantom whispered, its breath like Arctic wind against my ear.
"Stop fighting. Let the platform fall. When everyone dies together, there will be no more loneliness, no more fear. Just work forever."
I was losing consciousness when Jerry appeared with a fire axe and swung it through the phantom's torso. Somehow that worked, because the creature dispersed like smoke, and he released his grip on my throat. The warmth flooded back into my body, and I gasped for air. How did you know how to do that? When that thing had me, I could hear all their thoughts, Jerry said, his face pale but determined. They're not just dead workers. There's something else. Something that feeds on the concept of eternal labor. They've been collecting dead workers for decades, building, I don't know, an army? I guess tonight they were supposed to harvest us all. Around us, the phantom workers were becoming more solid, more aggressive. They weren't just touching living workers anymore. They were physically restraining them, dragging them towards dangerous equipment, forcing their hands onto controls that would trigger catastrophic failures. All the while, I still remember their screams. I still remember their begging for them to stop. I still remember the prayers that they uttered. The one thing I'll never forget was how horrified everyone looked. No matter how they chose to respond to this threat, whether through begging for mercy or trying to fight, we all shared one thing on that rig that night. We were terrified. I grabbed the platform's general alarm and activated the emergency evacuation sequence. Klaxons blared, emergency lights flashed, and the automated system began announcing, "All personnel to evacuation stations. This is not a drill." But the phantoms reacted violently to the evacuation alarm. They became fully corporeal, no longer translucent figures, but solid, angry entities, determined to prevent anyone from leaving the platform alive. The phantom of Jerome Herbert blocked the path to the helicopter pad, his form now completely opaque and radiating malevolent energy. Other phantoms swarmed the lifeboat stations, physically preventing workers from accessing escape routes.
"If we cannot have you willingly,"
Jerome's phantom declared, his voice echoing from every speaker on the platform,
"then we will take you by force. The platform will sink tonight. All aboard will join our crew. The eternal shift begins now."
I heard a jeep groaning from beneath us. Phantoms were somehow affecting the platform's structural integrity, using their supernatural abilities to weaken the support legs that kept us above the Gulf's dark waters. The platform began tilting toward starboard as one of the support legs buckled. Emergency systems screamed warnings about catastrophic structural failure. I think we had about 10 minutes before the Gulf Star collapsed entirely, taking everyone aboard down to the ocean floor, where the Phantom crew was waiting. I made my way through crowds of panicked workers and aggressive phantoms, until I finally reached the communications room and sent a mayday to the Coast Guard, giving our exact coordinates and the number of personnel aboard. I then did the only thing I could think of. I started destroying the timekeeping system. I figured that the phantoms were somehow tied to our employment records, to the digital documentation of who worked on the platform. So, if eliminating those records would weaken them, then it was worth a shot. I smashed the computer servers with a fire axe while phantoms swarmed around me, their icy touches trying to drain my strength. Each server I destroyed caused several phantoms to flicker and fade, their forms becoming less substantial. "The records!" I shouted to Jerry and the other workers who had fought free of phantom control. "Destroy all of the employment records! It's how they're anchored here!" We fought our way through the platform, smashing computers, burning paper files, destroying every trace of documentation that proved people had worked aboard the Gulf Star. With each destroyed record, more phantoms dissolved, and the structural damage to the platform began reversing itself. The final phantom to disappear was Jerome Herbert. As his form began dissolving, he looked at me with hatred and despair.
"You cannot destroy us completely,"
he warned.
"We exist in the records of every platform, every company database, every employment archive. We will find another platform, another crew. The eternal shifts will continue."
And then he was gone, leaving only the living crew standing on a damaged but stable platform as Coast Guard helicopters appeared on the horizon. I submitted my resignation immediately after we were rescued. Gulf Star was considered a total loss due to structural failure during routine operations. The official report made no mention of phantom workers or supernatural sabotage. How could they? There was absolutely no way to prove anything that had happened. I'm guessing that the ghosts, the phantoms, whatever they were, they decided to go into the security booth and destroy any records of them ever existing as phantoms. Unfortunately, Jerry was committed to a psychiatric facility after he kept insisting that dead workers tried to recruit him for eternal shifts. Most of the other workers who had been touched by phantoms suffered severe psychological trauma and never worked offshore again. I still have contacts in the industry, good friends of mine. None of them have gone through something like this, but they have heard rumors of other incidents on other platforms. They were always doing the same things that they tried to do to us on the Gulf Star. And every time they did, the structural failures were always catastrophic. And oftentimes there wouldn't be survivors. The Phantoms were right about one thing. Destroying the Gulf Star's records only eliminated them from that location. Employment databases throughout the offshore industry still contain records of workers who died in accidents, and those records serve as anchors for supernatural entities that view death as simply another shift for change. I work onshore now, at facilities where employee records only go back a few years and where industrial accidents are rare. But sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing timesheets, I think I see extra names appearing in the computer system. Workers who died decades ago but are still clocking in, still waiting for their chance to recruit the living for shifts that never end. If you ever find yourself working offshore and you see unfamiliar faces during shift changes, don't let them touch you, and get out of there as fast as you can. Order an evacuation, even if it costs your job. It's not worth losing your life. You don't want to join the eternal shift. I don't even want to know what the purpose of it is. But needless to say, I'll never forget that day. And I wouldn't wish what happened to me or anyone else on the Gulf Star on anyone. As a scientist, I'm bound by a code of ethics. I can't just go and form any task and claim it's for the name of science. That's the prerogative of some pseudo-villain in a children's TV show. The true people who are doing anything are the ones who choose profits over the safety and the decency of the people that they're supposed to protect and of the environment that they're meant to live in. My name is Dr. Elena, and this is my story. Thank you, the Dread Journal, for allowing me to share this. I worked as a subsea survey engineer for 12 years, specializing in seafloor mapping and underwater structural analysis for offshore drilling operations throughout the Gulf of Mexico. My expertise involved using sophisticated sonar systems, remotely operated vehicles, and underwater imaging equipment to ensure platform safety and environmental compliance. But nothing in my marine engineering education prepared me for discovering that corporate executives were willing to ignore catastrophic geological instabilities to protect their quarterly profits, even when those instabilities threatened to kill everyone working above them. When an offshore platform reaches the end of its operational life, federal regulators require complete removal of all structures from marine environments. Steel support legs are cut at the seabed level, deck sections are dismantled and transported to the shore, and every component is hauled away to prevent navigation hazards and environmental contamination. The removal process is documented extensively, with government inspections verifying that nothing remains on the ocean floor. But what happens when your sonar reveals that those thoroughly removed platforms are actually sitting on top of massive geological instabilities that could collapse without warning? What happens when corporations would rather falsify decommissioning records than spend the money to properly address seafloor hazards that threaten current operations? This is the story of how I discovered that the Gulf's seafloor was riddled with sinkholes, unstable sediment layers, and geological voids that could swallow entire drilling platforms, and how corporate executives tried to silence me when my findings threatened their bottom line. I worked for the now defunct Oceanic Survey Solutions, a marine consulting company that was based in Houston and provided underwater mapping services for major oil companies operating throughout the Gulf of Mexico. Our contracts involved comprehensive seafloor surveys that identified potential hazards, monitored environmental conditions, and verified that decommissioned platforms had been properly removed according to federal requirements. My supervisor was Captain Mackenzie, former Navy hydrographer who had spent 25 years conducting underwater surveys for military and commercial clients. Mackenzie was a straight shooter who believed that accurate data was the only thing standing between profitable operations and catastrophic accidents. The sea floor tells the complete story of everything that ever happened on the surface, Captain Mackenzie told new surveyors during their orientation briefings. Our job is to read that story accurately and completely, because the safety of current operations depends on understanding what came before. I really wish I paid more attention to his tone. He was not so much concerned about the safety of the operation. It was during a routine platform survey in September 2019 that I first encountered evidence that would change everything I thought I knew about offshore safety and corporate responsibility. I was conducting a seafloor hazard survey around platform Delta 9, positioned approximately 140 miles southeast of Galveston in 280 feet of water. The survey area extended 3 nautical miles in all directions from the active platform, mapping potential obstructions that could interfere with supply boat operations or emergency evacuation procedures. The sonar sweep was proceeding normally when, approximately 1.2 nautical miles northwest of Delta 9, I detected something that made my blood run cold. The seafloor showed massive subsidence, a depression nearly 300 feet across where the seabed had collapsed into an underlying void. But according to the official decommissioning records, this was supposed to be the former location of platform Charlie 7, which had been, and I quote, completely dismantled and removed 15 years earlier, leaving a clean, stable seafloor suitable for future operations. The sonar told a different story. Charlie 7 hadn't been properly removed at all. The massive steel platform structure was still there, but it had sunk nearly 60 feet into the seafloor as the sediment beneath it had liquefied and collapsed. The platform's weight had created a centralized and localized geological disaster, destabilizing a huge area of the continent shelf. Even more disturbing, the sonar showed that the subsidence was still active. Sediment layers were continuing to collapse around the sunken platform, creating an expanding zone of instability that was moving toward Delta 9's current location. I immediately flagged the anomaly and reported it to Captain Mackenzie, explaining that we had a major geological hazard that posed an immediate threat to current operations. If the instability continued expanding, Delta 9 could collapse into the same void that had swallowed Charlie 7. Mackenzie reviewed the data personally, his face growing pale as he understood the implications. Elena, are you certain about these readings? If this is accurate, we've got 142 workers sitting on a platform that could collapse at any moment. The data is solid, I confirmed. The seafloor beneath Delta 9 is showing stress fractures and early signs of the same sediment liquefaction that caused the Charlie 7 collapse. We need to evacuate that platform immediately and conduct emergency geological assessments. Mackenzie nodded grimly. I'll contact Meridian Petroleum immediately. They need to shut down operations until we can determine the extent of the hazard. But when Mackenzie called Meridian's operations director, Webb, the response was immediate and hostile. Absolutely not, Webb declared during the conference call. Delta 9 is producing 50,000 barrels per day. We're not shutting down a profitable platform based on speculative sonar readings. Mr. Webb, I interjected, this isn't speculation. The seafloor data shows active geological collapse. Your platform is sitting on top of an expanding sinkhole. Dr. Vasquez, I've reviewed your previous reports, and they show a constant pattern of overcautiousness that has cost our industry millions in unnecessary delays. Charlie 7 was properly decommissioned according to all federal regulations. Your sonar is obviously malfunctioning. I felt my temper rising. The sonar data is verified through multiple independent systems. Charlie 7 didn't disappear, it sank into the seafloor because the geological surveys prior to installation were inadequate. The same conditions exist between Delta 9. That's enough, Webb snapped. I'm terminating this survey contract. Oceanic Survey Solutions is clearly using defective equipment and providing unreliable data. We'll find a contractor who can conduct proper seafloor assessments. Mackenzie tried to intervene. Mr. Webb, regardless of contractual issues, we have a legal obligation to report geological hazards that threaten worker safety. I'm filing a report with the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement immediately. Webb's voice turned cold. Captain Mackenzie, I'd advise against making hasty decisions that could damage your company's reputation in this industry. Meridian Petroleum has significant influence with regulatory agencies, and we don't appreciate contractors who create problems where none exist. The call ended with Webb threatening to blackmail Oceanic Survey Solutions from all future contracts if we pursued the geological hazard issue. But Mackenzie and I knew we couldn't ignore data that showed 142 workers were in immediate danger. Over the next week, we expanded our survey to map the full extent of the seafloor instability. What we found was even worse than our initial assessment. The Gulf's continental shelf was riddled with similar collapses, all centered around locations where platforms had been decommissioned over the past 30 years. Platform after platform showed the same pattern. Official records claiming complete removal, but sonar data revealing sunken structures that had destabilized the surrounding seafloor. In some cases, the geological damage extended for miles from the original platform location, creating vast fields of unstable sediment that could collapse without warning. We documented over 50 locations where decommissioned platforms had created geological hazards, many of them beneath active drilling operations. The pattern was clear. Instead of properly removing platforms at enormous cost, oil companies had been falsifying decommissioning records while leaving the structures to sink beneath the seafloor. But the worst discovery came when we mapped the area around Deepwater Meridian, which was Meridian Petroleum's newest and most profitable platform. The structure was positioned perfectly above a massive geological void created by 3 previous platforms that had supposedly been completely removed, but had actually collapsed into underlying sediment layers. The void extended for nearly half a mile in diameter and was over 200 feet deep, a submarine cavern that could swallow Deepwater Meridian and its 200-person crew in seconds if the remaining seafloor gave way. I worked around the clock to document the hazard, using every piece of equipment at our disposal to create an irrefutable record of the danger. Seismic surveys showed that the remaining seafloor over the void was less than 30 feet thick in some places, far too thin to support the weight of a drilling platform. Even more disturbing, our instruments detected active subsidence. The seafloor was continuing to collapse, with stress fractures extending toward Deepwater Meridian's support legs. Based on the rate of deterioration, we estimated the platform had weeks, possibly days, before catastrophic failure. Mackenzie and I prepared a comprehensive report documenting the geological hazards throughout the Gulf, with particular emphasis on the immediate threat to Deepwater Meridian. We submitted copies to the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, the Coast Guard, and Meridian Petroleum simultaneously, demanding immediate evacuation of threatened platforms. The response from federal regulators was swift and alarming. Within 24 hours, BSEE investigators were en route to verify our findings and initiate emergency protocols. I wish they had got here sooner, because Meridian Petroleum's response was even faster and far more sinister. The next morning, I arrived at our offices to find federal marshals executing a search warrant. Webb stood in the lobby with a team of corporate lawyers, overseeing the confiscation of all our survey equipment, data storage devices, and research files. Dr. Vasquez, Webb said with a cold smile, Meridian Petroleum is exercising its rights under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act to protect proprietary geological data that you've illegally copied and misrepresented. That's ridiculous, I protested. The seafloor survey data is our work product. It documents public safety hazards. Oh? Well, according to our legal analysis, your survey data contains proprietary information about platform locations and geological formations that constitute trade secrets. By sharing this data with federal agencies without authorization, you've committed corporate espionage. One of Webb's lawyers stepped forward. Dr. Vasquez, you're also being served with a restraining order prohibiting you from discussing Meridian Petroleum operations with any third parties, including federal regulators. Violation of this order will result in immediate criminal prosecution. I I watched in horror as federal marshals loaded our equipment onto trucks while Meridian's legal team supervised. That was 20 years of survey data, including the evidence of geological hazards that threatened hundreds of workers, and it disappeared into corporate custody. Mackenzie pulled me aside, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena, they can't suppress the data forever. The BSEE inspectors are already en route to verify our findings independently. But Webb overheard. Captain Mackenzie, I'm afraid the BSEE inspection has been postponed indefinitely due to equipment availability issues. However, Meridian Petroleum has contracted with seabed survey specialists to conduct an independent geological assessment. Oh no. This was the worst possible news I could have heard. Seabed Survey Specialists was a notorious industry contractor known for producing reports that supported whatever conclusions their clients wanted. Their independent assessment would undoubtedly find no geological hazards, clearing the way for continued operations above an unstable seafloor that could collapse at any moment. That night, I received a phone call at home from an unknown number. Dr. Vasquez, this is Dr. Torres from the National Weather Service. I've been monitoring seismic activity in the Gulf, and I'm seeing some unusual patterns in the area you've surveyed. Can we meet to discuss your findings? Well, I had met Torres the next morning at a coffee shop in downtown Houston, bringing the copies of our survey data that had escaped Meridian's confiscation. They were backup files that I kept on a personal laptop for technical analysis. Torres reviewed the geological data with growing alarm. Dr. Vasquez, this is catastrophic. These seafloor voids could trigger submarine landslides that would generate tsunamis throughout the Gulf. And the seismic activity I've been detecting suggests that some of these collapses are accelerating. How accelerating? I asked. Based on the patterns I'm seeing, several of these geological voids are approaching critical failure. The seafloor over the largest caverns could collapse within days, possibly hours. If that happens while platforms are still operating above them, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Hundreds of workers would die in seconds, and the resulting environmental disaster would make the Deepwater Horizon spill look minor by comparison. Torres and I spent the next 12 hours preparing a comprehensive report for the National Weather Service and NOAA, documenting the immediate threat to Gulf operations and coastal communities. We submitted the report through the federal channels that Meridian Petroleum couldn't block, triggering emergency protocols that would force platform evacuations regardless of corporate objections. But Meridian wasn't finished fighting. That evening, I received a visit from two men in expensive suits who identified themselves as corporate security consultants. Dr. Vasquez, the taller man said, Mr. Webb wanted us to inform you that your collaboration with Dr. Torres has been noted. Meridian Petroleum has significant government contracts, and they're concerned that your activities might compromise national energy security. The shorter man handed me an official-looking document. This is a preliminary finding from the Department of Energy stating that your geological assessments could damage critical infrastructure if released publicly. Continuing to share this information could result in charges under the Espionage Act. I stared at them in disbelief. You're threatening me with espionage charges for reporting geological hazards that could kill hundreds of people? We're informing you of the legal consequences of your actions, the tall man replied. Mr. Webb hopes you'll consider your position before federal agencies overreact to unverified data that could cause unnecessary panic and economic disruption. After they left, I called Torres immediately. They're using national security laws to suppress the geological data. They're willing to let people die rather than admit their platforms are built on unstable seafloor. Torres was quiet for a moment. Elena, I've been monitoring seismic activity all day. The patterns are accelerating. I think we're looking at hours, not days, before major collapses. As if summoned by his words, my laptop began displaying real-time seismic alerts from NOAA monitoring stations throughout the Gulf. The seafloor around Deepwater Meridian was experiencing continuous micro-earthquakes as the remaining geological structure prepared to fail. We have to do something, I said. I don't care about legal threats. Those people are going to die. Taurus agreed. I'm declaring a geological emergency through NOAA channels. It'll trigger automatic evacuation protocols for all platforms in the affected area. Meridian won't be able to stop it once federal emergency procedures are activated. But even as Torres initiated the emergency protocols, I could see Meridian's lawyers working to block the evacuations. Corporate executives were calling federal officials, claiming that the geological data was fabricated by disgruntled contractors seeking to damage the company's reputation. It all came to a head at 3:47 a.m., when my seismic monitoring equipment detected the beginning of a massive seafloor collapse centered on the void beneath Deepwater Meridian. Geological structure that had been supporting the platform for months was finally giving way. I called the platform directly, bypassing corporate management to reach the radio operator on duty. This is Dr. Elena Vasquez with Oceanic Survey Solutions. You need to evacuate immediately. The seafloor beneath your platform is collapsing right now. The radio operator sounded confused. Ma'am, we haven't received any evacuation orders from company headquarters. There's no time to wait for corporate approval. Get everyone to the lifeboats now. You have minutes before the platform support legs punch through the seafloor. I could hear alarms beginning to sound in the background as the platform's structural monitoring systems detected the increasing instability. The radio operator's voice became urgent. All hands! Emergency muster! This is not a drill! For the next hour, I monitored emergency radio traffic as Deepwater Meridian's crew evacuated to lifeboats and awaited Coast Guard rescue. At 4:52 a.m., the platform's final radio transmission reported structural failure of the broken legs, followed by silence. When dawn broke, Coast Guard helicopters found 200 workers floating in lifeboats where Meridian Deepwater had stood 8 hours earlier. The platform itself had vanished completely, swallowed by a seafloor collapse that left a crater nearly half a mile across. The geological disaster triggered secondary collapses throughout the Gulf as unstable sediment layers failed in a domino effect. Over the next week, 3 more platforms were evacuated as the seafloor beneath them became too unstable to support continued operations. Meridian Petroleum's stock price collapsed faster than their platforms, and federal investigations revealed decades of falsified decommissioning records. Webb and 7 other executives were arrested for endangering workers and for environmental fraud. But the real victory came 6 months later, when Congress passed legislation requiring independent geological surveys for all offshore operations, with criminal penalties for executives who suppressed safety data. The law was now informally known as the Deepwater Meridian Act, ensuring that corporate profits could never again override worker safety and environmental protection. I now work for NOAA, conducting geological hazard assessments that can't be suppressed by corporate interests. The Gulf is slowly being cleaned up, with proper platforms and geological remediation funded by industry lines. But sometimes when I'm reviewing the seafloor data, I think about how close we came to losing 200 people because executives cared more about quarterly earnings than human lives. I was also flabbergasted by the ocean floor. Why was it moving so fast? What was going on with the tectonic plates? Was the ocean itself trying to tell me something? Or was it trying to fight back? I can't say anymore. I've seen a lot of things in my life, but there was nothing more horrifying than seeing someone just so callous over human life and placing their profits above it. No matter who you are or what job you seek in the future, please always prioritize your life and the lives of others before you ever prioritize any form of profit. You can always make more money. You can't bring life back.